Here we are once again on a Tuesday evening. Dos Equis. I am little Spinozy Vert,
Oh
joined by my trusty counterpart,
Playboy Descartes.
Playboy Descartes. And today we are going to talk about a Michael. We've got Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Michael Madsen. We've got Mike Myers, but there's one Michael who is actually the greatest of them all, and that is the homie, the one, the only, Michael Balint. We're going to talk about Michael Balint's Blind Alleys. What's Michael Balint getting up to in the alley anyway? I mean, all types of things happen in an alley. Very seedy, lewd, and sordid acts that can be indulged in an alley. In this case, we're just talking about, where ego psychology can go wrong. But this is already by now well-trodden territory. I mean, we have explored ad nauseum the limitations of two-body psychology. But in the case of Michael Balint and his blind alleys, Lacan is going to say that, and Lacan actually has for once like a tithe of uh, admiration for another psychoanalytic thinker, and he is going to uh, damn Michael Balint with faint praise, in as much as he believes that the merits of his ideas consist in the limitations, the blind alleys that they lead to, but the consistency of those blind alleys is what makes him, in Lacan's mind, a useful thinker, someone who's actually worth exploring.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was a really good intro on that, especially because he's one of the few object relation theorists that he's praised to for kind of coming up with something, but then not taking it too far because again, his blind alley, and it's like he's refusing to realize like the contradictions of the buildup in his theory. If I'm not mistaken, I think Balint was in that alley like on the end of that song Hollow Bones from the W album there where the Raekwon's like he's like, take off that bullshit ass chain you got on and them Tims, and you got the fake ones on, homie. That's Balint right there, wearing some fake Tims.
He said, matter of fact, run that object theory relation.
Run
Run that object relation theory right now. And yeah, I think this is the first time in human history that Michael Balint has ever been mentioned in the same sentence as Raekwon, most likely. This is the first. Call up the World Records Association. This preliminary chapter, preliminary interventions, there's not a whole lot to say here, but
Yeah.
let's not necessarily breeze over it, lest we miss some nuggets of importance. There's always something to
Yeah.
investigate, something to put the spotlight on when it comes to Lacan, even in these, seemingly mm, fluffy passages at the beginning of the.
He does like praise the work, which is a collection of essays on the primary love and psychoanalytic technique, and he's like, it's a good book to read. If you could get your hands on it, please do. I got my, he's stunting, he's flexing, saying like, I read it, but unfortunately, our society isn't like as rich enough to distribute it to all of you. So, if you could just get it one day, cheers.
I thought
But
that
he
was
just
kind
says
of a
like,
diss, right?
a,
Not rich enough this year. It'd be nice if you could read it, but unfortunately, the coffers are a little low right now. So
But then we got the homie Grenal, who gives an intervention on the whole spiel of love and hate, which is pretty interesting because like we're talking about something of a primary love, which we talk about a genital and genital love. And I think I might have said this because again, genital love or the genital plane, like you said in the voice note earlier, that it's getting referenced, but it's never really kind of established or grounded what exactly that is. But to kind of like give a background of it, it's something that Freud never actually used. I think he used genital so far as there is a libidinal invent in his like, you know, psychosexual stages. But it's early Freud. I think he starts to use those terms less, especially with like, you know, middle and late Freud, when Freud becomes more of Freud of drive, death instinct, which undermines any development. But we see this in object relations as there's some type of development. And this is something that Lacan is critical of. One of them is going to be this pregenital and genital love. So the pregenital love is something of a selfless love, right? Because in object relations, there is you and the object that brings satisfaction, an object that is not only just something of satisfaction, but like resembles, and again, it's something that we'll quote later that Balint uses or abuses, is this confusion between desire and need, but like it satisfies the need. I think that's something that should also be pointed out, but that there is this one point of selfless love in which like it's the fact that the object, or not like the baby desires the object of satisfaction, but it's only doing so instinctually, not out of like a sense of self.
But just to back up a little bit, when you say that this idea of genital love, what you're saying,
Pre-genital.
or but also, but right, but so we first heard the phrase genital love or the genital plane in reference to the Wolfman. And I think now that he's introducing a little bit later on, he's going to talk about Freud's notion of polymorphous perversity.
Yes.
Polymorphous perversity is juxtaposed to genital love.
Exactly.
In a
And
sense.
and with this genital love, right, especially for Balint, he mentions that there's this like confused or like this weird like split between, is it something of a normative moralizing thing, a natural thing, or is it a cultural end product? But genital love has this thing in which that there could be this not only sense of self, which of course there is some kind of selfishness to it. It's like, okay, I see there's an object of desire, but at the end of the day, that it is going to help me reconcile and overcome any difficulties in my unconscious. One of that, which is stated in the papers on the language of psychoanalysis, the definition is that there is this like overcoming of the Oedipus complex. So the overcoming of the father, and for, I don't know if Balint himself would use the Oedipus complex. I know it gets referenced in objects relations theory, but the critique of objects relations is that it's always in the imaginary. So it only has something to do with an imaginary father if we use these registers that Lacan displays for us. It has nothing of like a symbolic law.
Right. And what's interesting, this isn't exactly pertinent to what you're talking about, is that Lacan is very ambivalent, I think, about Oedipus, the Oedipus complex. He does allude to it, but I know in a later seminar, he also disavows having ever even referred to an Oedipus complex, straight out lying, because he refers to it a few times in this seminar. But you know, I think Oedipus is always on shaky ground with
Yeah, and
any analyst, but there's a lot of reliance on it. Maybe the over reliance on the concept by all psychoanalytic thinkers. Okay, not all, but most psychoanalytic thinkers, as I understand it, object relations people. But it's also disavowed to a degree.
mm-hmm. And I think if we're like, if he was sticking to the strict definition to Freud, then yeah, like, I could see why he would disavow the use of the Oedipus complex. And so much as so as like he's developing his notion of the symbolic and the real, it seems like there's something that like where Oedipus just can't fit like no more. We'll start talking about the real. Because the Oedipus takes form in something of an imaginary relationship, but of course there is a symbolic law prohibition within there.
Right.
But it seems like if once we develop something of the real, it's more of like if something of Oedipus or its remnants remain in Lacan's theory, it's that castration still, because castration still takes place in his graphs of sexuation. But it's he wouldn't use the term Oedipus complex, right? Because it's the father that castrates, or he would say the phallus, the law, and what it is the cutoff from like the any type of primary enjoyment. But it's like once you're castrated, like if you're already thrown in language, that's another thing. If we're talking about two different Lacans, and I think this is what's helpful, it's making me think like from what Derek Hook was having, what he elaborated on, these two anticipations of an imaginary mirror stage and then that of logical time. Well, if in logical time, right, he's there, these people, you don't know anything, just like the trial in Kafka, you don't know anything about him, in the fact that he's already on trial, he's already arrested, right? He's already, in the law. The same thing with these prisoners, they're already in the jail cell. We don't know anything about them. And insofar they're related to each other, and their freedom is dependent upon one another, symbolically dependent with these different colored pads or whatever they have on their shoulders, and the guard that is kind of like mediating. It seems as though if what we have right here is just like a Lacan of the imaginary and the Lacan of the symbolic, but it's like with the symbolic, if we take this anticipation of symbolic mastery, there's already castration as soon as we're born, rather than this like classical,
Mm,
or it seems like in this build up, this classical, all right, you're not only just polymorphously perverse, but then you go through this mirror stage, and then you're in a primary narcissism, and then you're in this, it's like it's not as simple as like this chronology. And he was against developmental psychology or any type of developmental evolutionary theory.
great point. Wow, you really put that into perspective there optically, let's say.
Yeah.
The idea, and that's why he always refers to, and I am going to absolutely stumble over this word, but natragl
Oh yeah, retroactivity. No,
retroactivity. I will master my castration of that pronunciation, but he often refers to retroactivity. I think that the emphasis there is to not just distinguish what the symbolic is in itself as opposed to the imaginary, but I think, and I could be wrong here, but maybe even at this stage he is very much eager to define what the real is, and that can only be done if the imaginary and the symbolic are defined as, in a sense, coterminous, codependent. And I think the whole point of the optical schema is not just to say, okay, we start with the concave mirror, we begin with the real object, the real image, and then eventually we get to this plane mirror, the virtual subject, and here we are. And like the whole point of the additive process of metaphorizing the inclusion into the symbolic, the birth of the subject, is to demonstrate how there is this sort of perspective that is flung back onto the imaginary by the symbolic after the fact, après coup, and that it's not just the distinction between the two, but the retroactivity
Yeah.
that defines the imaginary. And that's why the imaginary is very elusive. And it's sort of like, I think it was one of the episodes of Y Theory, I think McGowan said that, people like Zizek and a lot of other thinkers if you read their work, it would seem as if they almost dismiss, or not dismiss, but subtract the imaginary from the equation from the very start. And yet the imaginary is always there in some sense, but it cannot be understood on its own as this kind of primordial state. And that's what I think you can really miss the forest for the trees here if you don't take into account the optical schema in the context of his critique of ego psychology, and that the critique of ego psychology is not that they just don't have a distinction between the symbolic and the imaginary, but also that they don't have this idea of how even the imaginary itself can only be understood in the light of the symbolic. And tell me
Exactly.
if I missed anything there. But
No, that's definitely accurate, because especially like in when we're talking about something of a pregenital love or even like a primary narcissism, it's only known retroactively when you're in the analysis, when the patient is going through free associating. There we become to go, deeper in the unconscious. We realize some type of, in a sense, repression of a memory of a primordial scene, a primal fantasy, like this, that, and the third. That's been retroactively understood so far as we are creating the history of a subject in the present moment. Recollection of the past, a remembering, a working through. It's not about like, oh, we have an accurate representation of the child first and then work through, and that's what made the adult. It's like, no, we look at the adult and see the adult making the child by going retroactively back. And
which is
you mentioned that at the end of the
exactly, I was going to say that's the note that we end
yeah.
these two chapters on: the child in the man.
And this is not only you're talking about like this failure of ego psychology, but even how you see it today of that developmental. It's like, oh, something must have happened in their childhood, that's why they're this way. It's like, no, they're this way right now, and then if we go back to the childhood, they start to work through retroactively in the present moment. Even the homie Becker says that this type of logic flies in the face of empirical sciences, and where they're looking for A, B, C, D, etc., like going forward linearly in the way of the logic of how psychoanalysis works through.
And I think a lot of this makes sense suddenly once you abandon the stage part in mirror stage. It's very misleading. It is, on the one hand, an actual stage, but Lacan isn't interested in laying out stages in a Piaget sense of
Yeah.
evolutionary development, because he's smart enough to realize that you'll always go wrong no matter how nuanced your definition of those stages are. You'll always go wrong because, yes, you necessarily have to describe the evolution, the development of the child, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, the subject, in chronological terms, but it's what's anti-chronological within the recollection, the reconstruction of the subject's history within analysis, that really defines the subject, even though we might, when pressed to talk about our childhoods, strive to create a kind of chronology.
Mm-hmm.
The actual resulting form of our narratives are never that. They always
Yeah.
jump around in a sense. I don't know if that speaks directly to what you were just talking about, Andrew, but it's just
It reminds me of like the towards the end of Akira, where like he remembers like that he's in that like orphanage with the kid, and then Tetsuo. It's like they're retroactively going back through that trauma, through the breaking down of like the world right there.
right. Yeah. In that moment. And it's not
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense narratively, but it's like we are enveloped within those moments that kind of break down our sense of linear time. But okay, I think we're really digressing now, and we
I
should,
talk too much. I talk too
but I say too much. I say
much.
I talk too much. You are people of very great character to listen to me speak. That's what Zizek said when I saw him speak. He was like, at the end, it was very sweet for him. He was just, it was like 3 hours into his conversation. He's like, you are people of very great character to listen to me speak for 3 hours. You are a very great character. Thanks. I'm glad you think so. But all right, so on love and hate, this part is a little confusing because this Granoff guy is giving a lecture on Balint, and we don't have that present. We don't have that with us. So where
Yeah.
Lacan breaks in is supposedly, or presumably where he wants to clarify. Maybe
Yeah, and
certain.
there's not enough background on the genital or just like the object's relation in this and its framework. But obviously you would get that in Seminar 4. But like in some of the commentary I've heard from other like the one dude Donald Carveth, who's the objects relations, there is this like sense of like, if we take this thing of a pre-genital and genital love, the genital love is obviously, you have a developed sense of your ego and what you or I desire, the object of satisfaction. But there's something that is in prohibiting you, whether it's something of shame, frustration, privation, uh, all these different emotions, which reside on this imaginary plane, at least if we are Lacanians about it. But let's just take for object relationships, even with something like the imaginary relationship between the Oedipal complex, there is this prohibition that comes from the fantasy of the object, in which it doesn't allow you to get that satisfaction. So there's this ambivalence of love and hate that is always lurking within the object that is supposed to be your satisfaction. And the primary object would be the mother, right? And especially like the baby wants to breastfeed, the baby's getting fed. And once it realizes itself, or just like not even that, maybe it's a lot older, right? Maybe it's always getting affection. Maybe the child, like as a toddler or as like a, somebody in elementary school, they're getting all this recognition, but then the mother works. The mother's always busy. The mother doesn't have time. The mother's always tired. There's this prohibition by the object of satisfaction. So then the development of ambivalence of love and hate arise, especially if the child has a sense of self of my displeasure, my pleasure, the object that gives me both pleasure and displeasure, and this way of needing to overcome it through some type of moral tendency of genital love.
So the object becomes overwritten by a certain prohibition, and then that prohibition itself becomes central to the desire that is.
I use the term prohibition just because maybe I'm just being too Freudian, Lacanian, but it would be more the fact of frustration,
Frustration. Okay.
and in the sense lack. But here's what we get. Here's where like Lacan criticizes of the use of the term lack, but with need rather than desire later on.
Gotcha. So here he asks an interesting question: is what we consider to be a normal or natural state, be normal a natural state, or is it a cultural end product, something artificial, indeed something which he calls a happy chance? And we should point out what is being referred to here, which is, well, the theory of love, I guess, genital love. Remember, the interesting thing here is it's a stage that first we need to establish whether it or not it really exists in the sense that Balint defines it, but it's a stage that's reached. It's an achievement.
Yeah,
It's a
and to balance it is a development and an achievement.
And a lot of whenever I hear culture or like these questions of are we talking about nature versus culture, civilization versus just pure libido, it's like the question is always circles around how do we make this leap from a state of pure nature to civilization. That's not the exact question that Lacan's asking, because he's not interested in these larger questions of
Yeah.
the social contract and
No.
Rousseauian ideas of like how does civilization come around. But there is in microcosmic form a kind of version of that when we're talking about the subject.
Mhm. And he's into structuralism, not anthropology in the sense of
Right.
like how you're talking about of like social contract, the rise of like social engagement and recognition in the way of like what was around in his time, and even that was coming up like during Freud's time and after Freud, and even Freud kind of flirted with some anthropology, which you could see the distinction of his work from the beginning, where it was more on the lines of neurology, physiology, using biological metaphors, into Totem and Taboo and Civilization Discontent, where now he's using more like anthropological ideas. And it seems like these other types of analysts were like kind of using the same trend of like going through anthropology and kind of how like there's the thing of like you're biologizing your theories, they're being more anthropocentric about their theories, or what's the term, ethnography,
Anthropomorphize.
anthropomorphizing, yeah, like overly humanizing, but like in the sense of like you could find it in any other culture, like
Right. And that when he's asking these questions, I feel like he's channeling Balint. These aren't the kind of questions that Lacan
mhm,
tends to at least phrase in this way, but these are preliminary
yeah.
remarks. But what's interesting here is he explores this distinction between jouissance and joy, jouy.
Of enjoyment.
So we have the category of jouissance mentioned for, I don't know if it's the first time in this seminar, but the first significant mention.
I think it is the first time he uses it, but you recall that he does use it in function and field, correct?
He
And
does.
I think what he's trying to get at as far as enjoyment and jouissance, as far as like, and maybe he'll like overlay the two, like, you know, later on, but like, I think he is using enjoyment more loosely just to kind of connotate the way of like a personal pleasure. But the jouissance right here, I think this is what kind of alludes to the symbolic nature that these object relations forgets, and that's the fact of it's not just your enjoyment, but the other's enjoyment as well. Desire the desire the other, and the other's desire. This is the Kojevian thing in which he you know is interlaced in his work.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, it's never just the object of your satisfaction, because that's what your desire, your need, because you're deprived of it. It's rather you're deprived of the recognition of the other, that you derive enjoyment from not just yourself, but the other, and that's the mother. That's the, or at least that's something that object relations kind of brings like on a pedestal, is the mother, but it never shows the mother's enjoyment and how the child, the dyad, gets enjoyment from the mother's enjoyment. This symbolic mediation.
And also, it makes me think when you say recognition, it's like, what is going to be recognized? What is recognition but recognition of lack? So it's not enough
Yes.
to just, and this is, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves as usual, but it's not enough to just satisfy a need. With need comes desire, and with desire comes lack. And even when a need is satisfied, lack persists. And I think that what the infant once recognized, in a sense, is lack, which is what they are. What
Yes. And I think
subjectivity is lack.
Yeah, I think that's where he would want to get rid of term need, especially like, does he say it right here that how we're born? What is he called? No, it should be in the next one, but it's like we're like infantile, like we're born prematurely,
Yeah, it's in the beginning of the next chapter.
and so like there is no need right there. We're like born prematurely. We are caught in by this lure. We're stuck with it. We don't like get caught in multiple lures like in the way animals do, but this lure of libidinalized in our fragmented image and having mastery over our this sense of mastery, this duped, this misrecognition. That's the one thing about the ego which they don't have is this ego as misrecognition, as if they recognize the object that they just can't get. That might be a little straw manning of the object relations, but for the sense, it seems like there is this unwillingness to recognize the duped and misrecognition aspect of the ego.
No, that makes sense though, because it's like the lore is never for the animal its own image. The Whereas for the human animal, the lure is always, in one way or another, its own image. And a little bit later on, he's going to say that the progress in analysis can be measured in terms of how far along the analysand is in apprehending themselves as an object, which
Yeah,
bring them right back to the primordial relation with the lore of their own image, in a
yeah.
sense.
And like if they're their own object, they're not just an object for themselves, but also for others.
And we're gonna have a really interesting discussion about that in the second chapter here. But here he says that two body, again, Balint is in many ways, not typically, but is still very much a two body psychologist, entangled in a dual relation, denying it, looking for the symbolic and the imaginary, looking for the imaginary and the symbolic. And of course, what's disavowed, or not even disavowed, it's just not clearly sketched
Yeah,
out, is the symbolic for Balint. And this is the phrase that I just alluded to here. If not, how does an analysis make progress? If not through the interventions which impel the subject to objectify himself and to take himself as object. And what makes me think of is the passage à l'acte that I believe some theorists define as the end point of analysis, that passage to the act, the temporary suspension of the ego, or one is faced with the subjective form of their desire, and on that head, faced with themselves as pure object. It makes me think of something. I think there was a specific case. I remember reading this in Dylan Evans' Dictionary of Lacanian Psychoanalysis, under the definition of passage à l'acte, where Lacan refers to a specific incident where I think a woman like threw herself in front of a train or something like that, and how, I don't know enough of the details to really elaborate on it, but there's this temporary, sudden, momentary kind of biblical revelation where one experiences oneself as pure object, and that analysis doesn't want to make you necessarily jump in front of a train. But like, I don't know if that, I didn't have enough of the meat of that example to really introduce it there, but like how it impels someone to act, hopefully not
yeah,
commit suicide, but act in the sense that you change not so much through your will or through the application of knowledge to your situation, but you are changed by the objectification of yourself, by
Yeah,
your
like
yourself as object.
you become aware of the being, like in question.
The being,
It's not,
yeah.
yeah, it's not to, or the subjects in question. It's like it's not, we're not trying to strengthen the ego, synthesize all these affects again, which would just be strengthening or totalizing the ego into like what you were supposed to be, or like reorient your thoughts and behavior again, like what Lacan would say in function and field. Like he's like not impressed with behaviorism and trying to create like socially normative conduct to make you adapt. Analysis is different. It puts the subject in question. And I wouldn't know, yeah, like you said, like making yourself an object, not in the sense of like committing suicide, because there's what it makes me think also of that, and then making yourself an object, in which if there's this enjoyment of the object in some way like that, I feel like there is this moment of masochism in that sense. Making yourself an object of pleasure and pain. That's almost like of, in a sense, a perverse structure, which we do get into perversion in the next chapter, but that's what that kind of makes me think of too.
Bring one back to maybe the phase of polymorphous perversity that
Yeah.
originally defined their enjoyment.
Yes. I
Uh,
mean, it does make sense, because it's like if you talk about, and this is not kind of going out too far, it's kind of tying it in. If psychoanalysis is the only discourse that doesn't allow you to enjoy, but then with the transference, it's also love. With love, it's not like it brings out the most like erotic qualities, in the sense that sometimes there's this symbolic fantasy, or like this imaginary fantasy of your analyst, but then the more that the analyst doesn't fall for your tricks, the more that you are still duped, and the more that you have to go through these resistances, the more that brings forth these pathologies, and it brings them and overdetermines them to see who the subject really is, the discourse of the other. Because that's in a sense what love does. If we like, we talk about Plato as Plato's ladders of love, but one thing that really gets misrecognized is mania, that obsessive part of love that comes out, these like animal natures, and all that, not just eros, not just agape, but the mania aspect.
like
That's
in,
like, isn't it?
or well, I don't want to conflate too many ideas. It just reminded me of the Phaedrus, and
Yeah,
poetic madness, and
yeah, no, that's definitely an example.
I don't know if there's really anything to add to this preliminary intervention chapter lecture.
No, because it really just gets more elaborated. Like we really get into these blind alleys. It's like just a preliminary into like the main two concepts of like pregenital and genital love, but then like it's going to take a turn and kind of quote through.
Yeah, chapter, what the fuck is it? 17. Yes, I know my numeral, my Roman numerals. Chapter 17, the object relation and the
And
intersubjective relations. And now we're really getting into it. We
yeah,
start off with little discussion about Ferenczi and Freud. Not sure what the connection is.
yeah. So Ferenczi was like a colleague of Freud's and studied under him, and then he and a couple other people like Adler and Jung all went into their own things. Obviously, Jung developed the school in Zurich. Ferenczi is part of the popular like Hungarian school of psychoanalysis. I don't know too much about like what their theoretical background is. I think there are some type of objects relations theorists. That's the only thing I really know about Ferenczi.
Why does he mention him here though?
I think for the most part, like he and like anybody else who diverged from Freud diverged during his middle period before like World War II and the development of death drive. They're stuck on this kind of weird synthesis between a child libido development and a sort of objects relations type thing, and they're kind of if there's any rebellion towards Freudian theory, it's from those two angles and never from the Freud that Lacan is really kind of bringing out to fruition, in that of one who's adamant about speech, transference, and a repetition of some sort, which is known as like some sadomasochistic stuff. And we get the death instinct and death drive, which he wants to put more focus because that's where the money's at.
Right. He's always trying to rescue Freud from those who would dilute his doctrine in one way or another.
Yes, and not even just Freud, but of course, like the interpretation of Freud by Anna Freud. You know, she's only working with
Right.
you know, for of developmental theory, stage theory, stage not necessarily developmental, but stage theory.
Anna Freud, the Drake of psychoanalysis.
The Drake.
Um, so he says how, you know, I just homed in on the first italicized quote here, but this is countertransference, right? That like saturating the analytic situation with the indulgence of an activity that would sterilize it. Is that what is this countertransference? Because he does.
Saying that your analysis cannot indulge in that continue if you indulge in that activity, which through in some ways saturating the situation sterilizes in the full sense of the term, which might happen in the analysis.
I mean, yeah.
I would say, yeah, maybe if like, you are doing something that keeps undermining you and the analyst tells you to stop, or not even just tells you to stop, or ends it based on some type of like obligation of his or her duty, or like it'd become countertransference if they're trying to do it because they want to adhere to the patient rather than the treatment. Because in some ways, in the eccentric Lacanian way, it's like they will until they undermine themselves and make themselves look like a fool. And this is where he's saying, don't get too excited, right? If the analyzan and their own resistance or their own enjoyment of undermining makes themselves look like an idiot, in this case, you feel more intelligent. Don't get too excited, because in that way, you kind of everything's all there. You don't need to go down into some type of Nekia or like underworld like Jung. You don't have to like dig deep. It's all right there in what they're saying. You just have to listen. You just have to be patient. And like Lacan, like I think you said before, like Lacan is very complicated in the way that he, gives his presentations, even the way he writes. But as far as like as a clinician, he was like the most simple person ever. Like he like
Yeah, that's what I heard from an account from like a former priest, I believe, who was going through a crisis of meaning. This Italian guy that I listened to interviewed, and yeah, he was just like, yeah, like Lacan was the simplest of all people, which is, I mean, what an enigmatic figure. And I feel like for every person you talk to about Lacan, you get a different kind of Lacan, because we have the perverse Lacan, the sadistic Lacan, but this guy, I forget his name. I wish I could find. I mean, it's in Italian, but he talks about how Lacan was the simplest of all people, and he gives a depiction of a very sweet man of very wholesome and sort of homespun values. I think that's interesting. But
Yeah, he had a big circle. Like you see him in all the photos, like the old like photos of like Lacan. Like he's like always like with the
Oh,
group.
yeah.
He's always
He
like,
was a celebrity.
yeah.
Also, I feel like because Lacan speaks and writes in a way that is very labyrinthine, I'm learning to read Lacan, and one thing I've picked up on is to try to at least approximate some kind of central meaning from what he's saying. It's important to just look at like key words, like in this sense,
Yeah.
analysis, indulge, activity. It's like the syntax that he indulges in is always very serpentine and confusing. So it's, to me, not so important that you always follow the thread of the logic, but that like the key words stick out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd want to, I don't know, ask like a
It's like
Todd
a
what he
maybe
thinks about that.
like a you're giving like a full speech account for him. It's like
Exactly. And it's funny because that's something that in a conversation with Zizek and McGowan, Zizek said that in the seminars, Lacan is the analysand, which is kind of fascinating to think about. He's putting himself in the position of the analysand.
and he's making like the people he's talking to as subjects supposed to know.
He's hystericizing his audience too,
Yeah.
you know? So back to Balint, the homie Balint.
Good old Mikey Balint.
Him and his wife wrote this book together, apparently, which
Yeah.
Lacan highly recommends, says it's humorous, worth reading. Maybe we'll check it out sometime. I don't know. Probably not. Life's too short. But object relation. Okay, now we get to the knot of it.
Yes. They're not always like his metaphor, like the deadlocks or the knot of where like you see the contradictions
I don't
become.
know if at this point in his career he ever imagined that he would just be. Didn't at one point he would just like his lectures would just be him like tying knots?
Yeah.
Like throwing them out to the audience like Trump did in Puerto Rico that time with the toilet paper. Like that's what I'm him just like tying knots. People are like, guys, you gotta see Lacan. Like we're gonna go see Lacan tonight. He is the greatest living intellectual, maybe the greatest intellectual of the 20th century. You're not your mind's gonna be blown, and then they go there and he's just tying knots and like throwing them. I'm not saying that's what actually happened. That's how I picture it. So balance elaboration of the notion of object relation comes. It's a very, very simple concept, easy to grasp. The object relation, according to Balint, is one that conjoins a need to an object which satisfies it. And as I was saying to you before, this is an idea you don't have to study a word of psychoanalysis or psychology to come to a similar conclusion. When you say,
Yeah, and like that's the thing. It's like we're always looking like for something of like a satisfaction or happiness or pleasure, but like freaking Lacan say otherwise. He said, "Nah, son, no."
it's never that simple. And this is why Lacan says the fun is over, because it's never
Yeah,
as simple as all that.
Raekwon and Ghostface. Why can't it be so simple?
Why can't it all? Everybody's talking about the good old days.
Yep. But yeah, I think that's like important as like most people in psychology or just like any average Joe would just be like, I just want to be happy or I just want to be satisfied. But they never want that.
Right. And I
Even
think,
in like the most mundane of things, like, not just in analysis where things are inflated and brought to fruition, but like or like the overdetermined becomes more overdetermined. but like the like in the sense like like friends where you meet somebody and they're just like, yeah, like I'm just tired of people like that are always causing drama. I just want to be anti-drama, but then they bring the most drama, like just keep it like simple, stupid. Like everybody's probably experienced like people that say that, but then they bring the most drama to the circle. It's
Right.
like they
So
don't
like
want to be satisfied.
a good analyst would hear that and someone say, I don't want this drama in my life. I want to get past the drama. A good analyst would hear, help me maintain this symptom in a sense. Help me,
Mm-hmm.
or not just maintain it, help me derive again from this symptom the enjoyment I once had, is what they're really saying.
Exactly. Because if they didn't want drama, they'd be hermits.
Whatever you say you want to cure yourself of is the thing that, in broad terms, you want to uh,
Yeah.
continue. The thing that you want to maybe give new life to, in some sense, because it's well, I guess it depends on your situation. Either it's not yielding the amount of enjoyment that it used to, or the enjoyment itself might be too destructive
Yeah.
to a point
Which
where it's interfering with your life and other people's lives. But either way, it's never a clear cut cure me of this thing. There's a moment
yeah.
in The Sopranos that I really like where he says to a doctor or something, where he's like, can you just tell me what's wrong with me so they can like cut it out of me, so that pull it out. It's just like such a perfect visceral uh sort of expression of what most people want from psychiatry, psychology, from any kind of therapy, which is just like, can you remove this from me? But that demand itself is never as clear cut and simple as it might seem.
Yeah, and then like with mindfulness bros, CBT simps and all this, it's like that's what they get paid to do. They need to tell you like what's wrong with you or what you're not doing or what you need to do. There is the counter transference right there. Like they're telling you that, here, take home this workbook and do some deep breathing for 5 minutes. If you feel these reoccurring stressors that you identified and your breathing's not working, take a cold shower or grab some ice and hold it and count to 10 and like go out for a run, do some push-ups, do these things. They're like distractions pretty much. They build up more, you know, barriers or ego ideals. And it never really gets to the root of the problem. It's just like reorienting the way in which you can enjoy that same symptom from like a different perspective or position. It seems like it's like the symptom remains there, you just reoriented it in a way where it kind of feels like it's at a distance. I
in
don't know.
in in either case, I think it's sort of like, whenever there's an implicit subject in an intersubjective, well, there always is an implicit subject
Yeah.
in an intersubjective relationship. There's also an implicit object. The
Yeah, I get
problem is it's never defined because there's no real distinction in most of these systems between the symbolic and the imaginary. So we have this idea that there's a presumed starting point, which I think Lacan would say hasn't been under investigation, and investigation is warranted, maybe since Anna Freud, since ego psychology, basically. And the definition of an object is what's really in question here.
yeah.
So, sorry, good.
No, I was agreeing with you 100%. And the homie Sartre is gonna bring that up too, in existence with others of like how somebody could be an object for you until they start to interact with you through the gaze, through the look, and then it's an intersubjective relationship. But then once you realize they're looking at you, you become the object for them. But you're never just this pure object. And that's the question, is like, what is an object? There's this confusion about that. And not just like a theoretical confusion, but also in so far as there is a, maybe you could use the term, a pathological way of seeing yourself as an object, because it's something of enjoyment. It's also an enjoyment of the other, or you mutilate yourself for the enjoyment of the other by making yourself an object without realizing it, because that's such like an unconscious libidinal investment.
But before we get to that, just because I know like you have a really great sort of disquisition ready for us on that, but would you say that the problem Balint has is that in his framework, without him realizing it, there really is no difference between need and object within his framework.
Yeah, there's the, yeah, he doesn't understand the difference between need of the object and the desire for it, and that
Right,
need, he
right.
confuses with lack, where it's like, well, if all you need is food and stuff like that, then the thing is satisfied, right? The baby's satisfied from being fed. But it doesn't beg the question of what Lacan mentioned earlier, of jouissance, right? And enjoyment. Because jouissance is not something to need. Jouissance is a part of, he'll situate that with drive, but it's something that belongs to the other, which you want to have also
Right.
enjoyment of, so far as the other enjoys it. This is something that is like very much going to go beyond the limits of the imaginary or this blind alley, because we're getting into the symbol, the naming, the symbolic aspect of what's structuring everything.
Yeah. There's so many directions I want to go with that, but I want to redirect it back to the text here. So what Lacan's saying is it's not enough to say that the object is simply what saturates a need, because that doesn't mean much, especially in terms of a limit, prohibition, certain container that is just filled with the desired liquid of whatever the object is. Again, it's not that simple. And he's going to kind of leave the question in abeyance for a second, and then he gets into this whole topic of the animal versus the human, the animal backdrop according to Balint, and that there is this kind of like pre-established harmony, as he puts it here, between child and mother, and he calls it an enclosing of this is the first object relation of the human being, and both get a certain quantity of satisfaction from adhering to this pre-established harmony, and anything that really interrupts it is accidental for the
Yeah,
most
this
part,
is
but
part of
in
the
most cases it prevails so long as there's a child. And
yeah, this is part of that whole pre-general thing. It's like there is a harmony to it, and the point is to overcome the conflict with the general aspect, so far as that there is this privation, frustration, and maybe it's due to some type of Oedipus complex, um, in the way that object relations would use the term Oedipus, in the sense that there is like a prohibition or there is a lack of the object, right? There is like some type of, in the sense they want to use Oedipus like the way Freud or even Lacan would say, but like this distinction between good and bad object, that which not only gives me pleasure and satisfaction, but also what gives that object, which is the mother function, pleasure and dissatisfaction. So that's where the good object is always becomes, distinguished from that plane.
in that satisfaction and dissatisfaction are mutual.
It's like the displeasure and pleasure of the object is usually in relation to the fact of like, so if we talk about the object being the mother's love, right, then anything that displeases the mom is a bad object. Anything that pleases the mom is a good object. And so the baby or the child, the infant, or just child in general, will start to create judgments of objects of satisfaction, objects of, you know, pleasure and dissatisfaction, displeasure, just as good, bad, based upon that. But
So
if the object is the mother's love, right? I think the blind alley is the fact it's like, well, what what's getting at is the fact it's not just the object, but the recognition of the mother as well, right? That is not getting taken account of. It's like we're only focused on what the mother gives and what the child takes. But and so taking, so the mother could also take back as well once there's no more. Once there's no more to give, I should say. And that's what he was
okay,
saying.
okay,
Yeah, that's
right,
what he was
right,
saying.
right.
Yeah.
Beautiful lead up to what he talks about here, because it wasn't completely clear to me why he goes into this whole
Yeah.
uh,
And it does
spiel
go really.
about. Well, do you want to talk about what he where he takes the argument here with Alice Balint?
Oh yeah, yeah. As far as like when there's nothing more to give, the giver will take back. And it's kind of like, if, and here's the way I see it is like, again, we'll use the breast as an example because that's like the thing that object relations bros like to use is think of like, you know, the mother's the primary giver, the unconditional love, right? Because it satisfies she satisfies the baby's needs, breastfeeding, giving to a vulnerable child, right? But the and this is where I don't understand, because I don't know if they use drives to the extent that we would use it, but the baby will just keep feeding and feeding without any, you know, recognition that they're just drive, oral drives. So it's like the mother has to be the one to admission the fact that you're done, right? Either you're hurting mommy or I'm not, you know, lactating anymore. And it's with these little things that then we get the distinction between what hurts mom and what, like I said, what hurts mom and what is pleasurable to mom, but also the fact of I no longer have anything to give. And it's kind of like how the or what was said in a couple other chapters of like consuming Christ, this whole transubstantiation thing, the fact that the baby will just try to consume, you know, this, the drive, not just the baby, but the drive to consume it. It's something that the object relation is not really taking into account, is this drive to kind of not just consume the object, but it's really trying to just consume itself, because the drive is just, it doesn't care about anything. The drive is just blind. The drive is unconscious, right?
And it's like the baby wants to push mommy to her limits as the uh so that she will provide a testament to her love for the baby too, right? Like that's
Yeah.
the whole point, is that it's not like, it's funny because I remember being with my sister and her, my sister has a 2.5 year old, and we were at the zoo and she was giving Audra, my niece, like water, and she's just drinking and drinking. And I know she was thirsty, but I was like, well, when's she gonna stop? And don't get me wrong, I can relate to wanting to keep drinking, uh, doing it right now. But it's like, well, it gave me it made me wonder, like, okay, well, at what point does she realize that she doesn't want more water? And but is there also a point to asking for more, to
Yeah.
keep drinking,
And
in the sense of like prove to me, like almost bring me to that place of lack. Like I had a need, but I want to go to that place of lack.
That's interesting because you said the point of asking for more or just consuming more without even having a recognition that you want more, I think is another thing too. Because in the sense that you ask for more, there is for object relations theorists, there is what is good towards the mother's function and what is granted based off the mother's love. And then there's the fact of you just don't know because that is part of drive, and I think that's what object relations lacks, is, and that's how drive will undermine itself. But really what it boils down to with that, the thing about just consuming just because drive wants to consume itself, is the the infantile state or premature state that we're born into, which is why drive is so differentiated from instincts. And this is what he elaborates in I think this chapter as well. But also, oh yeah, he says fetalized traits. Humans being born into fetalized traits. The main thing is the fact that he brings us up into the mirror stage essay and the function of the eye in psychoanalysis, and why we are so prone to the lure more than animals.
But I didn't catch that last point. What?
So the fact that, like, because we're born in a state that is very premature, we don't have instincts like animals have instincts. That's why they don't use the lure like us. They're not caught in the image or like the gaze of their fragmented body.
Right. So there is a utility to the image, but it is also
Mm-hmm.
our undoing potentially to
Yeah.
pursue it. But what I was thinking of with that example, I don't know. I mean, she's maybe too young to really be able to do this, but you have need, you have demand, and then you have desire, and they're not all the same thing, but they are intertwined. And it's like at a certain point, the demand gives way to the desire to the degree that the need is satisfied, but the margin of difference that's left is the demand for love, in a sense. And
Yeah.
it's like it's one that can't be satisfied, but it's sort of like, and this can present itself in adult life, and does, especially when you're trying to have a meaningful relationship with someone. When you are trying to show your love to someone, you're trying to find some kind of balance, or what they call a healthy relationship. The issue is always like, you want to prove your love to someone, right? And consistently. And
Yes.
the idea is that, like, oh well, relationships stagnate. You need to, like, revive the ardor of a relationship at a certain point. How do you demonstrate your love? Well, it's like the paradox is always like, love is the thing that you can't give the other, right? Like, love
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the thing
It's
that you don't have to give, like, just to paraphrase Lacan, you don't have to give to the other that doesn't want it. And what's
yeah.
fascinating about that, it's like, how do you show that? Well, it's like, well, one, through excess, either excess, or on the other side of the other pole is almost like neglect. But either way, there is no real sense of balance, because this is what you were saying before about recognition. It's not just the baby who lacks something and then gets it, who lacks the breast and then gets the breast. They might have their need met, but then the lack itself persists, and you want that lack acknowledged. But it's not just acknowledged. You don't want to get rid of the lack. You want the lack to continue. You want the lack to be, in a sense, perpetuated. How can the other perpetuate the lack so that you can continue to exist? Because it's like the subject is identified with that lack in a sense.
Yes, and that's another thing. Like I'll agree with you on everything, but when we're talking about demand and desire, because obviously desire is lack, and it's the desire of the other. And with demand, right, it makes itself apparent in the transference love, right? Transference type and love phenomenon, and in love itself as well. One thing about desire is that when we talk about like the real image or the agama or the objet a, is that it's an object cause of desire and this lost object, right? But then in the fact where it shows up not only in the analysis but also in love itself, it's like at some point it becomes demand because you demand for it, because you realize you know that's something that's in that someone that they don't even know. You love them more for what they don't know that they have beyond them, and because they don't show it, they show like their flawed self, like they're not this perfect image that they once thought they were to be when they first fell in love, but somehow there's still that aspect in them that I still see, and therefore I demand it. Like or like I see like your flaws, whether it's like because you're lazy or just because like you're, or like all these other things, because we're human. But at the same time, I still have this paranoid feeling of being duped, that there's something behind the curtains of you, and that is that agama. In the same way of like conspiracy theorists, in the sense that they feel like they're not duped because they think that the whole fucking sham is run by pedophiles or Illuminati and cabal. You can't trick us, but at the same time, they demand them still. They demand this big other, this agama or oja that is in charge of everything.
Which is it's funny because like even you have QAnon people in the government running for office, right? And it's like,
yes,
that's the absurd thing, is that like I understand why, because they're telling their supporters, well, I'm gonna crack the case. I'm like, if you elect me, I promise to, in some sense, overthrow the big other from within. But the absurdity of it is that like they're positioning themselves as non-duped, as like, I know what the other of the other is, and I'm outside even that other.
yeah.
And then it's like, but the absurdity of it is that like, it's the ultimate, just as the inherent transgression ultimately cements the
Yes.
true power of the mechanism of this system within which we live. The conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorist is the figure which, like, let's say, like in the guise of the politician who is QAnon, ultimately ensures the smooth functioning of the system by offering the like final most libidinally charged outlet for one's jouissance investment, in a sense.
Well put.
I don't know, we went from like breastfeeding to that, and now we're going to talk about something that's on everyone's mind, and which we need right now to warm all of our hearts, which is cannibalism and eating your own child.
Yeah.
When there is nothing left to eat, you eat your child.
Yeah, that's a part of taking, like giving, or like taking back what you give when you have nothing left. But in the sense, like I see where he's getting at with that, because like this is what we were talking about, where I was saying like, these mofos were like resorting to anthropology to ground their analytic theory, whereas like with early Freud, it was like early and semi-middle biology, physiology, But then we have Lacan saying that it's not necessary that Freud was grounding his theory in biology. He's more using biological metaphors. And so we could use a structural way to kind of save him from himself. But without digressing too far, I think it's interesting that even though he's kind of critiquing him on this, it seems like he's critiquing him on this thing of the mother eating her child. I think there's also, in a sense, this way he still uses this as a metaphor for the fact of love, in the sense of like becoming the object to be mutilated and devoured in this, since in one of the sections of this chapter is perversion being the object, of masochism or sadomasochism. Not only do you, in your love, do you want to devour the other, you also want to be devoured yourself. Because what point would you want to be devoured, or would you want to devour the other without their consent?
That makes
Or
sense. Okay,
dragging,
that
or yeah,
because it feels like such an abrupt insertion here.
yeah,
This like because you're like, where does this come from? It's kind of the inversion of the need of the child. You're thinking of things from the infant's point of view, and then suddenly it's the mother eating her child, or the uncertain example of like ethnographers talking about pregnant women of inducing abortion to feed on the object of
yeah,
the pregnancy. And yeah, he just turns it inside out here suddenly by having the mother be the one doing the devouring
yeah.
in a
This
sense.
is this has got some like Jungian vibes too, because of the complex of the devouring mother, in which you got like an overprotective mother which devours their kids, like doesn't let them like pretty much be independent. They're always got to be dependent. The mother's always got to be, where they're at, like they're breathing the wrong way, or they're not sitting up correctly, or you can't hang out with your friends because you might get hurt, yada yada yada. Like, I think I mentioned this before. You've seen it, right? Have you seen? No,
No,
you haven't seen it. One of the kids is like got a devouring mother, and like he might up be like a neurotic, so he's like very like, don't do this, like no no no, like I shouldn't do this. Oh, I'm gonna get hurt. I should have just not done this, and I should have like just went to work and not called in sick. Like all these scenarios, just because like he's not used to being in a thing that's like not comfortable, or where he's structured, because he's just so devoured by the mother. So now even in this way, like he could rebel against the mother, devour the mother back, but it's only because of the fact of the devouring complex. Like what's being devoured is his own individuality, or his own, or their own sense of like, you know. And here's the thing: is like that's probably way different from like what Lacan is saying, because Jung believes in like this pure ego individuality.
but my question is like, is this the point at which like, so it's just confusing why he uses this example, because is this the point at which like something like tips over into from love to hate, or like something tips over into its extreme in a sense, like he's trying
So
to in very visceral terms, like gothic terms, kind of depict
yeah,
what
this
this margin of limit is.
this is like the limit of it. This is also because, again, when we talk about love and hate, it's a part of an imaginary relationship. And in a sense, it's like what's that old, there's a thin line between love and hate. I think Lacan is pretty much saying that, and it's a more complex term. There's a feeling in a notion of ambivalence within object that brings satisfaction, but which also could not bring you satisfaction, or which doesn't, what can bring you pleasure and fulfill your need, could also make you feel in privation, feeling of privation and displeasure. That's where the hate comes from. So they exist ambivalently and can come up in any form, especially if the object can devour back. And I think what is going to help ground this is when we start to get into the Sartrean aspect of intersubjectivity. It
Well,
does seem weird that he does bring this metaphor up of like the anthropology thing of the other devouring fetus,
but what's
but
interesting about it to me, though, that it just occurred to me, and it, in light of the fact that he just mentioned Jouissance for the first time,
yeah,
and you look behind me, or you see the face of Jouissance on Jimmy Stewart there. That's what it looks like. Jouissance is always about a limit to me, and I read this book, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend because it's not that well written. It's a little confusing, but it is enlightening in some ways by Darian Leader. This book called
Jouissance.
Jouissance Between Sexuality and God, I forget the subtitle there, but Mikey talks about it.
Yeah, that shit always
And
pops up on my Amazon.
it's an interesting book. You know, it feels like overly speculative. It feels like a little bit too granular in a way, but you know, he's trying to, and I understand the approach and like why he Darian Leader as a Lacanian analyst wants to kind of you know, streamline the idea of jouissance when there are all these different iterations of it. And I think if there is one kind of guiding thread with all the different definitions, all the different paradigms of jouissance, it is a kind of this sense of limit. There's always a limit, whether it's transgression or whether it's just bodily jouissance of the image. I feel like it's always based on a kind of a limit.
Yeah, and I think you wouldn't be too far to say. I mean, I'm still not certain how psychoanalysis uses the definition of transgression. I'm only aware of it in the sense of like how it works and operates in capitalism, like in the way like Zizek and Todd McGowan talk about. But in the philosopher of transgression, which is George Bataille, and it is a limit. It's the limit of consciousness because it's like in this kind of existential, it seems like he's got an existential way of approaching it, but like our consciousness is always unlimited. We always got like the multiplicity of different ways of living in facticity, right? But we want to escape that in these ways that are just in whole, and that's through transgressive acts. Like, because he's always about the notion of like expenditure and excess. Like, we're always living in excess, but we want to escape it in some transgressive way to be limited.
Right. Yeah. What the law?
Yeah.
The law affords us. That's really good. Let's put a pin in that for now.
To you know, take a quote from Lacan. You know, if you haven't read it, you should. You know, this is an exemplary text that every psychoanalyst should read.
Another, I'm surprised Lacan never said this. This is a guy I knew when I was living in Montauban, who said, quoting someone else, I don't know where this came from, but this would be Lacan. I haven't read your book and I hate it. I haven't read it and I hated it. No, I haven't read your book and I hated it. That's the way Lacan feels about a lot of different thinkers. But yeah.
No, with George Bataille, he says, "I haven't read your works, but I like your wife."
Whenever you see someone like Lacan in a picture with like a bunch of people, there's always like random women around, random dudes. Like, come on, they're all swingers. Like, let's not kid ourselves here. They were all swinging. God only knows the kind of weird shit they were up to. Not that you're weird if you're swinging, whatever. Not the kink shame.
We're just being prejudiced against the French.
Yeah, no, the one people you're allowed to be like categorically prejudiced against, and it's don't worry about it. They get everything coming to them.
They'll undermine themselves like 68, so it's all good if they try to come at us.
68?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
May 68.
What was the next year?
What's up?
The year after that was
69.
Yeah. All right, that's officially the smartest thing that was ever so far on our channel. So all right, let's not linger too long on any of this stuff. All right, the point here is we are, and I got the clap emojis, autoerotism. I always say
Yes.
eroticism, but autoerotism, that enclosed form of what they're going to call primary love, is it intersubjective to begin with? That's the big question that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Lacan doesn't care about the individual um, inflections of drive so much, oral, anal,
Yeah.
and then how we get the genital, or like some of the more anatomical fixations that
Yeah.
characterize Freud's system, as much as like, wait, where does the other rear its head, and at what point, and to what degree can the other already be included even in autoerotism? Because it would seem like, in an intuitive, commonsensical way, that at the very first stage of the autoerotic enjoyment, that there wouldn't be an other involved, and that like we would need to, let me back up a second. How is the other defined? Well, the other is defined as a subject, right?
Yes.
If you, and you can't conceive of yourself as a subject unless there are other subjects out there. So subjectivity is a two-way street, so to speak, to use a very
Especially when
basic.
I was talking about earlier about the symbolic anticipation in logical time, it's like you're always already thrown into language, thrown into the world, of Dasein. With speaking beings, speaking subjects, these speaking others, and maybe this is not the correct way, but I think this is a good interpretation from what you're saying of like, right, if this autoerotism, this polymorphous perversity, we don't be anatomical about specific drives, but we have something about mapping the body or erogenous erotigenous zone, or whatever you pronounce it, but like these zones of pleasure that aren't just merely genital in the way that Balint wants to fixate it on, that you could get sexual enjoyment from any part of the body that is mapped. And to be like, to talk about like the oral drive, like it's always not just mapped, right, but it's always coupled or on assemblage with the breast, with the mother. So there is that intersubjective relationship right there. Even if the child does not have speech yet at his or her disposal, they, like we said with little Dick, is a master at language, just terrible at speech.
Well,
So the symbolic is already there.
you reminded me of something that Zizek says. I think it might be in the ticklish subject, which is, and takes it up again in Sex and the Failed Absolute, which is the fascinating thing about human sexuality, is that you could say, well, it's geared towards, the reproduction of the species, and that's what it is. But like, the whole point is that genital love is an achievement. It's something that has to be strived after. And there are many people that well into adulthood don't reach a point of like being able to, let's say, love in a genital sense.
Yeah.
Like, it's not always achieved. Like, you could be a fully functioning person and there's nothing wrong with you if you don't in a proper like properly genitally love. And to that degree, you could say that like, even there are cultural codes that are built into that, where it's like you have homophobia and patriarchy, and that like, well, genital love should be aimed at the opposite sex. But that's not what Zizek is saying. I was just getting off on a tangent there, but like,
No, that's good though. That's making
one
me think of, but yeah, that's good.
I just want to point out, one of the things that Zizek said that once like really blew my mind was the idea that like, well, the fascinating thing is, people, you might think that like in a phallic society, that it's like, well, that is where that sexuality develops alongside the progression of puberty in the individual, of pubescence, if that's a word. But the fact is, there is a fully formed sexuality within the infant, which is polymorphous, that has nothing to do primarily with genitalia. So it's like, how do you explain this polymorphous perversity in the individual that isn't aimed at anything? And this is what Lacan was talking about earlier with trying to distinct, and it's very confusing when a lot of people say, well, like libido is ultimately sexual, and they talk about Lacan when they talk about the sexual, they never really bother to explain it, which is this, as I understand it, which it is this idea that the sexual is not necessarily genital. And what does he say about the libido? The libido is highly sexual. It cannot be desexualized, but the libido is not necessarily aimed at the propagation of the species. And that's the important thing to realize.
And that's what I was talking about with plebe and dangerous, maybe, because that's in the discussion of the update. Mikey brings up the fact of like why we need to read Alenka Zupansk's book, What is Sex? Because she aims at the that are talking about, you know, sexuality and the fact that, you know, psychoanalysis wants to reduce everything down to sex. Well, by saying that, you're reducing the meaning of sex to something of genital intercourse, right? Because sexuality is in the way that the bodies can enjoy. But in polymorphous perversity, there is just like this body, this huge amalgamation of drives of enjoyment in all parts of the body simultaneously and not in one specific place. But the notion of anatomy, and I saw this in a cool like meme that was like on Lacan and Freud and Lacanian psychoanalysis, but it's like anatomy means dissecting. In another way, when we're developing sexually, we're mapping the body of how we can enjoy. And in genital love, there is a specific way to enjoy, which has, in a sense, you know, a love towards a moralizing, neurotic way of enjoyment, but it has its own dialectic where it can not just overdetermine itself, but negate itself. And you can see the incels in which they want to disavow women, but at the same time, they strive for this image of women in a genital sense. However, if we look at another forms of like sexuality and mapping the body, like let's say the ears, like and maybe this is an overdetermined way because of technology, like the way capitalism and the production of technology. ASMR. Why do people like ASMR things? Right? It's a fetish, and not in a perverse way, but the fact that they get some enjoyment in some type of ASMR of nature of people like, I don't know, like rubbing nails in the chalkboard, even though that's weird. Some people like that, or like people eating. Like the list goes on. Music, right, for the ears, or like playing video games and like or like doing something like popping, you know, fucking was a bubble wrap. Like these are forms of enjoyment in which there's partial acts of sublimation. Of course, Lacan would say that there's only one sublimation that could aim at your desire or your sexual, you know, satisfaction. There's not multiple sublimations like. But the thing to drive away is that there's not just genital love, and even if there is for Balint, if there's genital love, you have to account for this like intersubjective relationship that he's just not acknowledging because he still goes back to the framework of object relation.
Well, what interests me about what you're talking about there, and like interpreting this in the like larger space of the discourse that's going on in anti-Oedipus, it makes me think of what it puts into perspective the question that was asked at the beginning of this, where, well, he's just paraphrasing Balint, but like, well, is there such a thing as a normal state? Is analysis something that occurs along natural lines in a sense? And it's like the question of sexuality is always the question of something artificially determined to a large degree, which is like the solution to repression, as many people commonly think of it in like a sex positive way, of course, is to free sex to be the kind of organism it's meant to be, what it is for itself rather
Mm.
than the way it's like redirected into certain social channels. But the fascinating thing, like to me, is that it's like it's always mediated by some kind of structure of, it doesn't have to, we don't have to get to ideology yet, but like the other is in a sense always involved. I think that's what Lacan's getting at here, is the other is always involved, even at the autoerotic
Would
level.
you even say in the sex positive way, in like and I will bring ideology, like in the liberal sense of sex positive
Yeah, sure.
revolution,
Yeah.
it is always in the frame of genital love of some sense or the other.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. Because it's still an achievement. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You have to think of it as an achievement. Because whether
Yeah.
it's incels, right? They're
Or through OnlyFans chicks, it's still the achievement, but in a sense, it's the sublime object that can never be achieved. It's the sublimity of genital love, and the fact that you can never reach it because you can't overcome it. Because it's, maybe you could say it's Oedipalized, or there's an Oedipalization, or just, I don't know. There's just
I'm
so many
gonna
things.
I'm gonna jump out of the window here for a second and say that there's actually, in a really perverse way, some kind of truth to what incels are saying, not in terms of like the actual patent
Yeah.
truth of like what is like what exists on the surface of like their categories and all that other weird fetishistic stuff, but true in the extent that like their very twisted sublimation works and reveals something about the nature of sexuality to the degree that it's like the programmatic denial of being an object of desire and defining why you are not is in itself fetishistic and reveals something about the structure of sexuality in a category.
That and yes, and one thing I like want to add, so we move on. We're not too cut off, but this this is definitely something that needs to be written. But it also hides the fundamental anxiety that exists within genital love because of this achievement
Mm.
that can't be, or this notion of achievement that can never be achieved. It hides the real.
Because it's like, because this is the fascinating thing, is that it's like, well, how is it that if something is supposedly natural, let's take the example of the conflict within Marxism, if it's something that is supposed to be historically realized and achievable on by its own on its own accord through its own self-generated momentum, in a sense, then why is it there has to be a proletariat revolution at all if it's supposed to happen naturally on its own?
Yeah.
It's like the same thing with sexuality. It's like, how is it that we need to uh, think about and practice and cultivate and fashion our own sexuality to meet a certain cultural demand in order to be fully realized when sex is meant to be quote unquote natural? It doesn't make sense. It's a
Yeah.
paradox, but this is the
Yeah.
paradox that is at the heart of everything. This is why Freud's always talking about sex,
Yes, it's
because
not
this
because
is the
he wants to
paradox.
reduce everything about sex. It's the fact that when he's talking about sex, there's something that is being reducible. Or it's like, or Zizek says it's like, it's not that it's like psychoanalysis is only thinking about sex. That what when the analyzan is thinking about sex, they're, or in sexual thinking about something.
Right. You think it's
Yeah.
like the whole, men think about sex every 5 seconds kind of thing. It's like, oh, these guys are always thinking about sexual intercourse. You can't stop. It's like, actually, the question should be, why is it that people feel the need to depict men as so horny, let's say, all
Yeah.
the time? What does that cover up? What does that, you know, uh, paint over, in a sense? That's what sex is. not intercourse. Sex is the fissure that you want to hide. And now I'm starting to really finally understand what the point of, at least
Do you,
according to me,
do you
this
think
chapter is.
Arnold Schwarzenegger knew about sexual difference with saying that he was the pump was like coming?
Well, Arnold Schwarzenegger is, in his own way, like the most sexual being to have ever existed. He is Jouissance embodied. He is Humescence embodied. He is like the ultimate. All of humankind, I think, might have actually been working towards his creation, or Donald Trump, one of the other.
God damn.
Anyway, we're really getting off topic here, but I think this is once you get us talking about sex, us boys. So this whole idea of like primary love as this self-enclosed thing, the fascinating aspect to this is that Balint can't really make heads or tails of what's going on here with love, because he's already at the stage where the symbolic is predominant. It's like once you get to the symbolic, it's the same thing with Oedipus. You're like, all right, finally, we're at the symbolic. We're out of that kind of murky, hazy area of the imaginary, but you don't. But the two are still very much almost like miscegenated to the point where it's like, well, where is the object in all of this? And I think what Lacan wants to say is that like what's imported in a very subterranean way into the imaginary in Balint to save the symbolic and to make sure that his understanding of the symbolic is on firm ground is a just projection into the first stage of the second stage. So there is already, and it's like this is the problem with most philosophical systems, is when they're trying to outline something in a stage development way, they always like they're always in a rush to get to the apex of their system, which is when everything comes together, when the symbol really takes hold, when it becomes in like self-sufficient for itself. Everyone's in a rush to get to the for itself, and then they take that framework and say, well, it already existed in a nascent, undeveloped form within the primary stage, in this case primary love. So if I understood this correctly, it's like there was already the possibility for object relation in primary love, it just wasn't achieved. But it doesn't say anything about these two stages, they're the same thing.
Yeah, it just seemed like, yeah. And the question of like the human wish, and again, like we talk about lack inflicted on need, and then like desire merely emerged only out of frustration. It's like that literally only depicts a certain subject not able to attain an object, when we already know, according to Lacan, that desire is something symbolic. The symbolic is the third between intersubjective relationship. So I think overall, like to sum it up with Balint, it's like he's pointing things out that are in an intersubjective relationship, but he never leads towards that. He's always retracting back to object relation of a subject and the object, not the mother's recognition, not the mother's speech, but the mother's object, which is love, making love the object of desire or the object of need, rather than the fact that maybe it's not that there is this object within her that is love, but rather the recognition and duped that there is this object called love.
There's a lot to unpack there. So you're saying that he sees the object of need as love?
Yes, because that's what the whole thing is that in object relations is like the object is not the mother necessarily. I think I said that I was saying that just because I was talking too fast. You know me, I say provocative things, but no, the point is like it's not necessarily the mother that is the object, although I think the baby or the child in this dyadic relationship will confuse the two, the mother and the object of the mother. But ultimately the object of the mother is is the love, because it's not just the mother. The mother is nothing without the object, which is the love, right? What the mother has to give.
But
But he's not like recognizing he in that point he is with when it comes to this intersubjective relationship, but he doesn't want to stay on this point, which could lead to the third, the symbolic. He's always going back to the framework of object relations of the child or the subject and their object of this, or their object of need, the object of satisfaction.
right. But wouldn't you say it's like love is not an object of need at all?
Yes, exactly.
And that's the issue. And it's so funny because people will say like, oh, a baby needs love. And of course, in everyday speech, that makes sense, but it's not a question of need.
Yeah, because we don't know what the baby needs or wants. The baby is just a bundle of drives. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's just neither good or bad. It just is the case of the baby with drives. But there could be something creative from it. Lacan is not someone who would be, I would say, in his theories, be against that. Especially, he was influenced by D&G's critique of psychoanalysis, so that's where he comes up with the lamella drive of something that's disembodied. There's still sexuality, there's still a mapping, there's still this dissection, but it's still creative in a sense. It's just not like creative in like Young Bros, where it's like, there's this mythic archetype imprint that's just creating this Herculean, like, it's not like that, but just ways of enjoying, ways of mapping yourself in the world, mapping, mirror staging, whatever you want to call it, it intersects. But the point is that the baby has drives. It's mapping itself, and in the sense, what Balint is not doing is well, what he is doing, I should say, is he's confusing need and desire. That's the main point. We
Right.
should beat that like a dead horse. He's confusing need and desire.
And he says here, the basis of his thought is need. In English, he says everything with an 8 next to it. The basis of his thought is need, and it is accidentally in lacking that need makes itself manifest as wish, and that really is what is at issue, is the human wish simply, or oh, sorry, I should read that as a question. And that really is what is at issue. Is the human wish simply the lack inflicted on need? Does desire emerge only out of frustration?
Yes, and
And
it's
I,
like the frustration is the object relation.
right, because doesn't
Frustration.
you define frustration as an imaginary lack of a
Yes,
symbolic object?
yes, most
Privation
definitely.
is a real lack of an imaginary object. And then I think frustration is an imaginary lack of a symbolic object,
Mhm.
ultimately.
Yeah,
And that would
Becker goes over
explain,
this shit too.
right,
Yeah,
right.
because he's already on seminar 4.
I'm gonna hit the head real quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah, no worries. I could probably do the same. We'll edit this out.
All right, almost finished here,
Yeah, we're not too not too far.
but now we're getting into the real Storm and Drang, as the
We're
Germans say.
perverts.
Polymorphous perversion.
Like
Polymorph.
DMG said, we're all perverts.
We're all perverts. The polymorphous pervert. It's our first mixtape. Polymorphous, polymorpheous perversion.
Polymorphous verse.
Polymorphous pervert. I got too many words in my. No, I don't know. Not about the rap. I was like, oh my god, where am I going with that? I shouldn't have never.
On some Andy Milonakis shit right there.
Shout out to Andy Milonakis. That's the next guest on the pod. I want to hear about his polymorphous perversion. I'm sure there's a lot to say. I love Andy Milonakis, great guy.
Fun waiting.
So if Lacan ever tells you he's never talked about the Oedipus complex, we got receipts.
Yeah,
right
we're
here.
about to audit this motherfucker.
You got the receipts. What is that? You just said Oedipus complex.
He's capping. He's capping.
Capping hard.
In all caps, like an angry message.
It may be what he often talks about, pretending to lie,
Yes, the pretending to lie.
So, all right. What is this primary perversion? He asks. What is the pregenital? It's funny, it's in the phrase like pregenital. Once you say something like that, you're already posing the problem in a language which would imply the lead up to, again, an achievement, right?
Yeah.
So
it's, would you say it's like a meta language, like to try to say like there's something
yeah.
for what? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's something meta-linguistic here. I think this is what he wants to draw our attention to.
And then he asks the questions like, is balanced notion of object relation applicable to both perversion but also phenomenology, right? Or the phenomenology of perversion?
Phenomenology of love, yeah. And yeah, that's a tough question.
Because we're talking about the things themselves, right? And if we talk about this prenatal phase as like something of like a meta language, and there's no way to have like really a true phenomenology of it.
Yeah, because explain that to me.
And at least as far as phenomenology that we're talking about in the sense of at least what we're getting into Sartre. So we've got things like voyeurism, exhibitionist relations, but like the overall this relationship in which we'll talk about the gaze or the look, right? But the thing about a pregenital relationship is that there is just purely a selflessness, but also like the fact that there is an object of enjoyment, but I don't have any awareness that I enjoy it or that is what I desire. Which is already confusing in itself, like the more I think about it. In the sense we're used to talking about drive, and we're talking about primary narcissism. But even things like drives of primary narcissism, it's always thought about retroactively, right? It's not like this evolutionary thing or developmental thing. But it seems like Balint is trying to make that the case. Would you say?
That he's trying to find these primal instincts or drives that are at the heart of.
Yeah, the heart is like there's pregenital love and then there's genital love, and that's the problems we're trying to achieve that. What I'm trying to get at with this thing of phenomenology, right, is because as far as we're talking about the look in Sartre, there is this recognition, the fact that somebody is not just an object, right? That they're a subject. Now we enter the intersubjective relationship. But then the moment they look at me, I become an object for them by recognizing, oh shit, I am the object. And what we talked about in the and what, or not just we, but the audience, so what's talked about in Sartre's phenomenology of being in nothingness, since the look, it's the moment that I am looked at by other that I become an object. And what object means to Sartre is in the same way as a scientist observes something, right? A scientist can observe a plant, a cell, that is the object of biology, the object of a botanist. It has no intersubjective relationship. There is this, disinterest study of this thing. And it also brings back the kind of the thing where Lacan talks about we're not this abstract I like the man of science. And Sartre echoes this too in saying that if I look at the man in the park and then these gestures come of him doing these things, he may look back at me, whatever, even if he doesn't look back at me, I may have this cogito of I am observing this man who's also has the potential for himself of looking back at me. So there's no longer just this pure subject-object relation, but an intersubjective relation. And in the fact of now I know he is looking at me and he knows that I'm looking at him. And that's the thing. We know that we both have this instance of looking at each other. That's what makes it unique. And for the fact of perversion,
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask.
we enter the symbolic aspect because for the perverse, for as far as a clinical structure, it's as if they take the symbolic in their own hands, like some type of identity, but they identify with the symbolic, they identify with the superego and give the consent or the prohibitions of pleasure for themselves for their own enjoyment. But at the same time, it's still on the other for that. They still rely on another person, but they somehow in their weird clinical structure identify as that symbolic other, that symbolic third.
Well, I don't know if I really know what I'm talking about, but I saw it more as like in becoming an object for themselves, perverts posit a third. There doesn't need to be an actual other person involved.
So in the sense of like, I think if the perverted has a fetishism,
Yeah.
if there's a fetishism, I think you're right on that. I'm more explaining the sadomasochistic aspect of it. Because there's different aspects of the perversion clinical structure as far as symptoms, and it could be the sadomasochist, sadist, masochist, the voyeurist, exhibitionist. We saw, in a sense, that the rat man has a voyeuristic type of tendency, but then there is some type of obsessional neurosis that keeps him from committing the act on the women that he's voyeuristically staring at as changing. He only touches them in certain ways, but he never actually truly violates them because of some obsessional neuroses. But he has some type of perversion in how he observes them, which is it's hard to really kind of create a closed circuit of diagnosing perversion. But the way that Mikey explained it is that perverts stand in this weird threshold or tightrope of the neurotic and the psychotic.
Right, because it's like they're possessed of the bare minimum of coordinates needed to sustain a symbolic relation with the other, but it's almost as if it's always threatened by the possibility of dissolving into a psychotic.
Yeah.
relationship.
And they believe themselves at some point in their weird acts to be the embodiment of the other, a manifestation of the other.
And the confidence of the pervert is the belief that they're able to control that. And
You ever seen the movie Jumper?
No.
It's with Hayden Christensen and Samuel L. Jackson. I see Samuel L. Jackson as embodying some sort of perversion, as identifying with God, because the jumpers are like people that could somehow like teleport, and he like literally kills them with this weird rod that like has like a weird taser at the end and kills them like that, like by shocking them. But he believes that nobody should have the power of God but God himself. But yet he's killing them in the name of God and identifying with God. It's like he's taking the law in his own hands in this perverse way. He gets some like sadomasochist enjoyment out of killing these people with abilities.
Very relevant to what I sent you today. If you when you read my essay, I get into something similar.
Oh, okay.
I'm really I'm really eager to hear what you have to say about that. But our viewers don't care if not yet. They will.
They will.
The
They
sadistic. So let's talk about our favorite subject, the Marquis de Sade, the sadistic relationship. I like this metaphor he uses here. I don't know if the sadism is not one being no more than reacting flesh, a kind of mollusk whose edges one titillates and which palpitates. The sadistic relationship no longer exists. What is the sadistic relation, Andrew? You being a arch sadist yourself, the expert on the subject. No, I'm just joking. What is the sadistic relation?
Well, the thing is like if we're talking about this phenomenology, at least I'm tying it to the intersubjective relationship. It's like the sadist, right, can devour and take pleasure of devouring the other, but at the same time, it relies on the other as object. But I think there's something that was said earlier about like, for this to happen in this perverse structure, there still is a reliance on the intersubjective aspect of the other as an object, as having consent, since there is still this weird relationship with the law. But it makes it perverse just because it's weird. Like, it's just like at one point they will be the law, but then still rely on it in the other as to consent to their act of, and he's tying it in with love, because it's like, you're in love with somebody, but you could still devour them for what's supposed to be had beyond them, their egalma, their objet that they don't know, but but you with their consent, you could just mutilate them.
But keeping it at a distance, keeping it in abeyance, something that can't be laid hold of. And I like what he says here. The sadistic subject will stop there, suddenly encountering a void, a gap, a hollow. The sadistic relation implies, in fact, that the partner's consent has been secured, his freedom, his confession, his humiliation. And that's how he's defining consent, which is really interesting. It's not about what could be derived from garden variety sexual intercourse, the orgasm, touching another person's body. It really is symbolic.
And
in the most pure form.
And it makes me think, like, I think what Lacan has mastered is the understanding narcissism with symptom. And we're not talking about narcissism like narcissistic personality disorder in the way that DSM-5, diagnosed as, although I don't think it would hurt Lacan's thing, but the fact that this does have a symptom to it. But, and again, there's always this void in any type of symptom. the symptom is an enjoyment of a fantasy because ultimately there is a lack. There is no holistic subject. A narcissist is enjoying its object because that's what it ontologically is. It's ontologically split. It's ontologically lacking. But there's this grandiose idealization of the narcissist, of the symptom, and it could manifest in multiple ways. And it seems like the sadist has this weird narcissistic tendency by identifying with these symbolic acts, by identifying with the law, not even in an imaginary sense, but in the symbolic sense.
The what's interesting also is that masochism is much more universal than sadism, because there is something like a primary masochism. Wouldn't you say? I could be wrong about that, but it's like
sadomasochism, because it's not just directly on ourselves, but we need the other.
but wouldn't you say though that maybe too often we want to collapse the two into one?
Yeah.
And that, because I think Lacan famously says sadism is not the inverse of masochism. They have two different structures. And if there is such a thing as primary masochism, then it's much more universal than sadism, which what I would think would be perversion in its most concentrated form.
I have to.
I don't. Okay, I might be
think about that one, but
going off the rails there, like, because once we get into perversion and sadism, then it gets really complicated. So let's not.
yeah, no, it
Yeah,
really
let's not get hung up.
perversion. It literally could have like multiple books on it in the clinical structure, and you would still not be able to, label it, because like even in like the language of psychoanalysis, it was written in like the 70s. They have homosexuality and transvestites as perverse, but one could argue that they're really not like that in a sense, or at least like homosexuals, lesbians are not, right?
Right.
However, you could have that orientation and be perverse, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're gay or because you're lesbian that you are perverse. I think that's something that has definitely been evolved over time just because of the identity politics that's going on. However, there's just so much with the clinical structure of perversion that the symptoms just, if you are not on your toes, can be duped by.
Right. Yeah, and we need to scrub it of its cultural residue there, of its.
But I think at least for this specific lecture, what's trying to be aimed at is the fact of some type of dependency on an other, not a
Right.
physical other of the eye. Although yes, as far as like sadomasochist, masochist, sadist, yes, but the other as far as symbolic structure. It's not an imaginary identification of an object. It's this symbolic other, something that doesn't exist. It's a fetishism. Like I think maybe fetishism is the foundation, if not just another symptom of it. Maybe
Well,
fetishism
yeah,
is
yeah. Because is it Freud who says that? Well, this sounds a little too extreme for Freud, but kind of the fetish is the last thing you see before you enter the void. Basically, void here, it's sort of the part of the mother, for example, that you fetishize, that you fixate on, that becomes a fetish for you in your sexual life later on, it's not so much about the object in itself as it is maybe the time marker that it in that it not symbolizes, like the time marker that it marks in that moment, for lack of a better term. It's like there's always a scene involved. There's always something, and when there's a scene, there's the void, and there's the screen, for example. And the screen of trauma is that which does the job of screening an abyss.
Yes, yes.
But let's get back to, all right, let's get to,
I feel like that
sorry,
echoes into seminar 10 though, like the anxiety one.
my favorite topic. Okay, we're finally back to intersubjectivity, and our boy, the OG, right behind you. All of his books are white for some reason.
JPS.
We've got Jean-Paul Sartre, the godfather of evil cultural Marxism, the scourge of our good American society. He's right
Thought that
behind.
was Derrida.
Yeah, but just ask JP. He'll tell you. He'll tell you. Before Derrida, there was this motherfucker.
Stephen Hicks even says that Jean-Paul Sartre is a postmodernist.
He was a Marxist.
Yeah,
he belongs to culture. He said some things. He wrote some books. He wore glasses, and I believe he was quite promiscuous as an individual. So I think he might as well be the Antichrist.
Even William Lane Craig has some negative things to say about him.
Sartre might be simultaneously the most badass and the most cringy of all thinkers. He's not so much cringy. Like, I wouldn't say he's cringy as much as like the fandom around him is cringy.
Yeah, I agree. And the more I read him, the more like I kind of am like kind of opening up a space in my heart for him, because I used to like be really annoyed by him. But when you look at his background, this motherfucker literally fought in the resistance, fought in World War II, was a prisoner of war, and was writing the transcendence of the ego and being in time, or being in nothingness, like while being a prisoner of war. It's like, get out of town, bro. Like,
that's why,
I'm just a prisoner of war, but I'm not.
Same thing with Wittgenstein, who, as much as we malign the analytic tradition, like Wittgenstein's a badass for writing the Tractatus.
Yeah.
In the trenches during World War One. Like, that's
I think Wittgenstein is probably the only cool analytic bro that has anything to offer.
Oh,
especially this such thing as a private language. It's like you could tie him in with Lacan.
No, Wittgenstein is well worth.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be that guy who's just like, don't read this, read this. Like, I don't want to be too. I read some post the other day that was really good about like why you shouldn't be dismissive of any specific philosopher of notes, oeuvre or their works, and like, but I would say that the exception to that is like logical positivism, and Russell, other than like his introduction to philosophy and like Western philosophy, or what is it, like what is philosophy, but like Carnap, Russell, logical positivism, Frey J, however you say his name.
Oh, Frey.
Like, I would go out on a limb and say like you can absolutely skip all of that and dismiss it wholesale, because it's like
terrible.
Principia Mathematica, like it was a resounding failure, all of that. And like, even people who are in the analytic tradition, they don't even read it. Even people who are like the inheritors of the analytic tradition, nobody reads Principia Mathematica. It's just, I could be wrong. Maybe one day I'll read it and be like, you know what, everyone was wrong. They're totally right. But I would say you can skip it. Anyway, sorry. Back to Sartre. Sartre is actually a badass. It's more so that, like, what's interesting is like all of theory is kind of just funneled into the image of Sartre as this existential kind of it's like Camus and Sartre, like these two guys, two opposite sides of the coin that like when you learn about existentialism in English class in high school, those are the guys, and it's reduced to essence versus existence versus
Yeah.
essence, and then the stranger, and then you read Camus the stranger, and that's it.
And you never really get to how their methods were developed. But like, I think I can't stand Camus. I think Camus just ruined it for me. But like, start reading him, you really see Hegel's science of logic and just the overall dialectic of Hegel and self-related negativity. And Hegel at its finest with the fact that being as a category cannot really be pinpoint. It's determined by, negation. And I think Sartre was really good at applying that with subjectivity. And this is something that Lacan is going to bring up as well. Like, the ego is its own, or it's just subjectivity in general, it's just its own bundle of affirmations and negations. It's never really a fixed thing. It's always decentered. Desire is a lack.
Right. I need to study more of Sartre to understand how he came to those conclusions outside of psychoanalysis, because I know he didn't have the nicest things to say about psychoanalysis, but from what I understand, Sartre is kind of the more popularized form of Heidegger's philosophy.
Yeah, and he definitely misunderstands a lot of Heidegger. To what extent, I can't really break that down. But the two things, being in itself, which is ultimately determined to be a nothingness, and then you got being for itself, which is the ability within that nothingness to transcend one's facticity and unlimited possibilities because of that annihilation of nothingness towards a limited understanding of yourself or of existence based upon your choice. But within that threshold of the two, you have bad fate.
But isn't the dichotomy of for itself versus in itself Hegelian in origin?
In the sense, like, I'm trying to understand it as like, because obviously he builds up between the in itself and for itself, but it's like, and then obviously the for itself is always not just going to be for itself purely, but also for others, hence the existence of others. I want to say that his being in itself and for itself has ontological grounds, which may seem like he's presupposing a lot. But there is a dialectic between the two, because the being in itself obviously going to be the body or the being in the world, but it can never really determine itself as itself. It's always alienated, always exteriorized in the world, in its facticity of not knowing the proper conduct of what to do. So there's this finding of for itself what bad faith is, and like he tries to argue that it's not the unconscious, it's just really bad faith. The bad faith can make you feel like that you're doing your things for yourself, like where he says it's like the cafe busboy does with a smile on his face to the best of his ability, and like he's doing things like that he believes is right, but really he's living in bad faith because he's not living up to his facticity of being for itself. He's rather undermining that aspect, limiting his possibilities, and being this like purgatory where it's like he doesn't recognize the unlimited amount of possibilities that he has as a being in itself, and the fact that he could transcend that and limit those possibilities by being a being for itself.
You know what I was thinking, like, just occurred to me. Sartre is kind of like the Steven Spielberg of philosophy. This is why. Like, Steven Spielberg is a very good director. He makes very entertaining movies. He makes movies that tug at the heartstrings, that appeal to people's emotions and affects in a variety of ways. He works in different genres. Ultimately, even at his best, he's never that challenging. And that's why I think it's the same with Sartre. It's like he draws from different philosophers. He, let's say, in a sense, creates within the confines of different genres and also like without those confines. He's very appealing. He's skilled as a philosopher, but he never reaches that point of being truly provocatively challenging.
I could see that.
I don't know. That's just an idea. Yeah, that's like I'm stretching it, but this is just a thought. The Spielberg
Sartre was kind of the celebrity though. It's like Lacan.
Just like Spielberg, like he's considered this great auteur. I like a lot of his movies. Does he really challenge?
E.T. Existential theory.
Oh shit! God damn. All right. Well, let's leave existential out of it because that's kind of a dirty word.
Yeah.
You know, because that unfortunately, but it's sort of like ask Reddit.
It's just the stigma that and meaning of it that just
Existential crisis. What does it all mean? Like, I hate how, let me just go off on a diatribe right now, but it's like almost one of those things. It's like it's already baked into the idea of meaning itself, which is this crisis of meaning. I don't want to dismiss that necessarily, but I feel like people perform oftentimes these like according to a certain script, what it means to go out on a search for meaning, for the self, whatever. And it's like always just a kind of like Hollywood version of that. And unfortunately, existentialism, which is associated with Sartre, is at the core of that, which is this sort of performance of the search for meaning. You know what I mean? And it's like as if one day, like I know people are searching for meaning and are drained and feel adrift within capitalism, but I think that again, it's like the thing with like Zizek is he's always pointing out how within these different tropes of Hollywood movies and the way they are structured in a narratival way, it defines how we view our lives. It's the same thing with like the search for meaning and how it's like one day you wake up with an existential crisis and you're like, what does it all mean? And then you go on a search for the answers. And yes, Sartre is associated with that, and existentialism is associated with that. And I guess my beef with it is that it really takes away from what there really is to be discovered in theory, because it usually begins and ends with Sartre.
Him and Nietzsche for some reason in the pop culture.
And I love Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's great, but unfortunately these guys are like, you know, they're
really getting confused with Camus
of themselves, essentially.
They're really getting confused with Camus, and Camus was never even a philosopher. He was a freaking literary writer.
I don't like The Stranger personally. I don't think it's a very good novel.
I tried to read his Myth of Sisyphus, and I just couldn't get into it. I tried to read The Rebel, I just could not get into it. Like, I'm not saying he's a bad writer. He's definitely a good writer. He's definitely a good writer, but he's not a theorist. And with Sartre, he never mentions anything about meaning. He's always talking about enterprises in the world or someone's conduct in the world. And it really has to deal with the same concept of Dasein projects, just a slightly different take, but he's never asking about the generalized universal meaning of the world, because he's a dialectician. He says that it ultimately undermines to a nothingness. It's kind of in the same way of in the sense of like, if for Hegel God is absolute knowledge, well then we can't really have that but the absolute knowledge of the subject, which is also the substance. It's always split, and but it there's always a sublation of it. However, he would not take God as one aspect of that, because Sartre's an atheist and he critically examines the phenomenological aspect of the ontological proof in being and nothingness, of that being a being outside of me, because that also can apply with the concept and phenomenology of the transcendental ego, which Husserl tries to prove, but Sartre just undermines in the transcendence of the ego. And not trying to get off too topic to talk about phenomenology, but this is the Hegelian aspect of Sartre, as he's trying to keep things within the things themselves, but also seeing a sort of dialectical aspect of it. So he's seeing this essence as existence, a split of a being in itself and for itself. And in the notion of the gaze, there is this aspect of the for itself taken outside of itself, since the for itself or just being in itself is already alienated. So even to be for itself seems like alienation. To Lacanianize it, it seems as though as to be for itself is not to be this individual aspect. Rather, it's more of an ego ideal. To keep it back at Sartre with the gaze before we Lacanianize it, it's as if though the freedom in our possibilities and our limitations are taken outside of itself by the other, and it's and being objectified by the other. That's the good. Feeling of shame because I'm a peeping Tom, because I'm a jealous lover. I don't realize that in my facticity of being a jealous lover, being a peeping Tom, because I think that my wife is cheating on me, and I'm looking through the window or I'm looking through a peephole. But when I hear the doorbell ring or like footsteps from the other room come across, then the facticity of my existence is thus brought upon me as a reflect of myself as being what I am in itself, a jealous lover. Then the whole world draws upon me and I become an object for the other. And I think what Lacan is trying to
yeah. No, sorry, go ahead.
So what Lacan is trying to get at is the fact that gaze is important, not just for the analytic session, but the fact that the perverse relies upon the gaze, and something that is not just the eye, which he'll talk about later in the gaze in seminar 11, but the fact that, like, I think this is a buildup, the fact that the gaze represents some type of recognition of the law of even this whole thing of consent of consumption, like you can sue me upon my consent because you are the law type shit, or you embody yourself as the law.
Isn't it right? Exactly. And I think it's what Jacques calls the being the agent instrument of the other's desire, and the sort of solace that that would afford the subject is to, if we're going to take it back to the praying mantises, and that or the example of the praying mantises with the masks over their heads. Am I conflating two things here, two different examples, or is there the not knowing what you are for the other? It creates the ultimate anxiety, basically.
Yes,
that's the ultimate generator of anxiety. So all different psychic structurations are, the one thing they have in common is they are all strategies to deal with at least from a Zizek'ian point of view, gaps within reality. And
Especially when you talk about love, though.
well, I just want to, but just to finish the thought, it's like, but in perversion, there's a reversal where you are, where it's not S barred lozenge A, but A lozenge S barred, in that you instrumentalize yourself to be the object of desire for the other, and so that you have a something like a stabilized sense of what you are for the other, which reduces anxiety. That's how I interpret it.
Okay, yeah. No, I agree with that. And what I was gonna say was the fact that, at least in the love aspect, like if there's this anxiety of not knowing who you are towards the other, it's the fact that like simple like city boys, incel shit, like never having a relationship, but you really are in a relationship, but not letting the other know what you are specifically. But yet you engage in these things that seem like they are a relationship. Like you go out, but like you're always just having like different nights of sex, but you're never engaging in anything more intimate. You're confusing the other, and so therefore there's this anxiety of like, what are we? It's like, oh, like the city boys, like the hood bill shit. It's like it's been 365 business days, and she's already using the word "I love you" or using the term "I love you."
Right. And then with the example of the typical incel, though, trying to pinpoint the exact physical details that make one attractive or not attractive, as if one could know what the other wants. But also, it there is much more comfort, even if it's the worst fate ever of being like categorically unfuckable. There's
Yeah.
much more comfort, in a strange sense, in knowing exactly what you are for the other, even if it's the worst thing ever, than that liminal space of uncertainty.
Mhm.
In a sense, and everything that's called into question here, everything that's dealt with, kind of almost a slide whistle movement from, or seesaw of desire that's going on here in the gaze. I think that what he wants to draw attention to, Lacan, is not just the fact that you become an object for the other in the gaze, but it's the kind of reciprocity
Yes, that's
that
the main thing.
exists between the two. It's like, let's think about our boy Brian Becker, Thought in Motion. It's not just the static moment of the being caught in another's gaze, but the back and forth. That's why Lacan wants to make the gaze itself a drive and add to Freud's drives, because it isn't just because the way Sartre depicts it's very interesting. It's very intriguing. It approximates something very close to what Lacan's talking about, but it's it takes the form of like almost like a portrait, something you would see in a museum. It's very petrified.
Yeah.
What Lacan's talking about is a thought in motion. There is animation between the two.
Yeah, not just the homie Brian Becker, shout out to Singularity and Sublimity, but Dr. Derek Hook, again, with the logical time essay and the dependence of the other. This determines the scopic drive in Seminar 11, right, of the gaze. Like, it's not like just this abstract polymorphous perverse desire, sexuality, also this desire, so long as it's drive the recognition of the other, of the I, of or not even just I, but just of like the field of vision in which you're recognized as an object. It seems like symbolically situated, and that your freedom depends upon the other.
How can we take this back to the optical schema real quick?
Well,
That's the
we
question.
always think of ourselves as the abstract I until we really think about it, because it's like we're supposed to be the I, right? But again, we're not an abstract I. The eye of science always wants to pervert things by making things into a mutilated object, a sadism, right? By trying to know things, by trying to be paranoid about it, until it has to deal with them, especially like when it comes like Sam Harris bros. Well, science is about human values. It's always been in the business about morality.
In the business.
It's always been about the business of morality until it comes to Islamophobia.
No, but like, no, you're right. With the optical schema, though, when I think about this, it's like I feel like what Sartre might be missing is he doesn't understand the desire is the desire of the other.
Yeah.
The only thing he doesn't understand, this is why I say it's static, in that there he creates these different tiers of consciousness that are useful, that are illustrative, but don't get at what Lacan's talking about here, which is everything that you see outlined in the optical schema, which is that the other is already present in the very act of being seen, and that other is you, and you are the other, and that this desire is transitive. And ultimately, there is a kind of schism running through the what could be seen as like kind of a clear, much more clear interchange, a disturbing interchange as it exists in Sartre, but it's still very clear. It's still kind of value laden, and it's still very much equally weighted on both sides. Whereas like with Lacan, what we have is a almost MC Escher like visual conundrum that's going on, and I think that's what he wants to draw attention to. The gaze is very important, but here's the interesting thing: is that we have this idea of the gaze, and McGowan talks about this a lot, like being a film studies professor, how the gaze is one of the most predominant ideas in like feminist critiques of film, and how it's the male gaze, right? And it's like
exactly. It's never gaze, it's the male gaze.
And so it's
and
the
they
male gaze
presuppose
very contingently defined and inflected, and it's we're seeing things from a male perspective, and of course there's a lot of truth to that, but it misses
it's truism, but it's never the truth.
But what it misses is the sliding of signifiers, the shifting.
Because if they call it the male gaze, then there's sexual relation, right? It just seems like
exactly. There is the myth of a possible complementarity, even if it is subverted.
Yes,
there's still the myth of the possibility of an ultimate complementarity, and the complementarity on the level of genital love, and that's why I think he's relating that to what we're talking about here, and why he's also subverting. Sorry, the funny thing is, like I was saying earlier at the very start of the broadcast here is that whenever Lacan shits on a lot of people, but when he shouts you out, he's still damning you with faint praise because you're not
Yeah.
Lacan. And if you're not Lacan, then you're wrong. That's
That's
why
his perversion. That's
that's
his
his
perversion.
perversion. That's his perversion. But when even him shouting out Sartre here, he's still damning him with faint praise,
Yeah.
since it like Sartre doesn't quite get it
Yeah.
right in that. Well, as usual,
He literally told Sartre, he said, once you heard Wu added a blue, your family from Shaolin.
flashbacks to the day room. Exactly. You know, the real heads will get that reference.
Exactly.
People don't know that the whole point of our operation, it's a complete ploy to get you to listen to Wu-Tang. We don't actually
It
care.
really. It's like
Uh,
the meme rate. It's just like Raekwon and Ghostface, the modern Joycean foreclosure of the father.
well, it's like when Joyce met Yeats, the great poet Yeats, who was at that point in his life, like Joyce was a young man. Yeats was uh, most uh, the most preeminent of all the literary figures in Ireland at the time, and Yeats gave him some praise, and he had worshipped Yeats, but you know what he said? He was like, "I don't care for your opinion any more than I would that of the man on the street." That's what Lacan's saying to Sartre.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I owe you a lot, but I don't care any more for your opinion than that. Anyway, the the gaze, it's complicated. To put it bluntly, like there's so many different directions we could take this in, but I feel like we are talking about being an object for yourself, and how the thing is, it's like with Balint, there's still this presupposition of a fully formed conception of the parental agent
Yeah.
that would already assume the possibility of object relation, where the whole point is that the that Lacan's trying to make is that, as I understand it, there never is this fully formed notion of the other in one sense, nor is there a fully self-enclosed autoerotism that is
Yeah.
sundered by the introduction of the other. And that's the whole issue with like I and thou, and how you could ever form the notion of the other as subject, is that like there is no one developmental point where one sort of slips into the other suddenly.
These cats are going crazy. You hear that?
You know, they like the gaze. They're watching you. You are
No,
caught in their gaze.
no, these cats kept wrestling and I just freaking stopped them and they just started attacking each other.
Why do we like cats though? Because like they watch us,
Yeah.
and we're not caught in their gaze, knowing that they are subjects, right?
This one right here.
And here we have our third guest ever on the channel. What's your cat's name?
This one's Cleo right here.
Cleo, our most prestigious guest yet, and she's gonna make her contribution. Speaking of gaze, look at those eyes.
Yeah, she's a shark.
Look at those beautiful eyes. I love it.
Yeah. The other one's an ass. She's the Lamella. That's her name. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, because she's
That's
just
so
hyper
sick.
productive. She destroys everything. That's what I was going to get her away from. She's just trying to impede on the other person's peace. Literally, was trying to provoke a fight with her.
The feline lamella, and what's more
Yeah,
lamella like? What's more id like than the cat?
exactly. Right. So indifferent upon human well-being.
So that now he gets into like what sounds like if it's true, it's extremely upsetting convention that exists within bullfights, where it's pretty much like a special needs person who's like maimed by random animals. I was kind of confused, but like what he was talking about, because Lacan, as usual,
Yeah.
describes everything in the most like abstruse ways possible, and like whether it's even true or not is up for question. But like
Yeah.
what he calls a semi-idiot, basically what we used to call retarded people. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, he calls semi-idiot. But in in Becker's video, he says it as the autistic subject. So I wonder if it's like him imposing that on there, or if that's like maybe just a weird English translation from the original French, which it should translate into autistic. But whatever French word is used, it probably translates as a semi-idiot.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. Sounds a lot autistic sounds a lot better.
Yeah. And it's just in the fact is like not that the autistics are idiots, it's the fact that they have their own language structure, which they're in a sense they're not, and this is probably why they were also confused with psychotics, because they were just not duped by the symbolic order. They just don't have a like a firing of like recognition by the big other or the other. Like they're just not duped.
But what is this form of entertainment here where they have the they cajole this semi-idiot into interacting with these animals. He's afraid, but eventually all of the clamor of the audience gets to him, and he's caught up in the structure of the situation. And I don't what does he mean he takes on the characteristics of the sacrificial attitude?
Yeah, that one really
Like
got me too. Like,
confused. Like what does he talk like? Uh, at any rate, he gets too close to an animal, which he shouldn't get close to.
yeah, yeah, but it really got me as well. Like, it's like, what the fuck does he mean? Like,
The most annoying thing about Lacan is like when I don't mind when he explains other things in a weird, complicated, idiosyncratic way, but like he'll talk about just an example, like just something happening and describe it in the most weird way, like where you like I don't even know what you're talking about. Like you're just trying to like here's an example for the purpose of illustration, and then it's like what the fuck are you talking about? Can you please just like be clear for once so I can follow you? But it's like I don't really know if anyone can help us understand what's
yeah,
going on. But it seems like the semi-idiot provokes these animals in a way that he's like, you know,
mhm,
immediately flattened and then carted off. And that
yeah,
was a source of amusement. But here we have the ambiguous zone of intersubjectivity where at a certain point something takes over. Something uh, a an influence comes to predominate in a certain situation when the pressure of the clamor, when within kind of I guess imaginary relation, something reaches a pitch.
Yeah.
And I guess as he says here, the whole phenomena is thus reduced to that level of intersubjectivity,
Yes. Which
manifestations we connote as perverse. But I guess the point is not so much to define perversion as much as to define how intersubjectivity is at the very core of what's happening in any
I think what
situation.
it's also showing is the fact that intersubjectivity is not just object relational, but it's not as fixed as far as this accomplishment of genital love. So there is this condition of perversion. And not only that, perversion can exist without intersubjectivity. But this, it seems like perversion is not trying to be defined for its own sake or for a clinical structure, but to defy balanced notion of genital love in an object relation, while in some cases he is trying to point out some aspects that have an intersubjective tone, but he doesn't want to go there. He just goes back to his framework object relation. But there is a polymorphous perversive aspect, maybe. I don't know. That's what it seems like to me. The main thing is that this intersubjective relationship, not only is Lacan trying to use this, just to counteract Balint, but the intersubjective relationship is the two body that accounts for a third. It's not purely intersubjective in the phenomenological sense, because that's where he critiques Sartre. He critiques Balint for slowly getting to that realm, but then going back to object and subject. Lacan is worried about is two body and a third, which is a two body is both intersubjective personnel, with the third being speech.
So, but balance blind alleys do balance failures
Yeah.
do a better job of delimiting a space for a third than most other ego psychologist systems.
Because he's got like things with the object as far as like, right, so any object has to be like, if you don't have the object, it's privation, frustration, lack, right? He's saying you have this primary love, you got genital love, then it's grounded by of tenderness, and then there's a distinction between love and hate, but then like overall this like love comes from a tenderness. This is still on an imaginary plane and still on an aspect of only grounding the subject and object. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't it tell you like what allows a purely subject object, and that if the object is the mother's love, what is the mother then? A subjective person, right? So you have an intersubjective relationship.
And again, it's this solution to continuity between the imaginary and the symbolic that we're looking for. And I think that one of the difficulties of trying to, and he says it's ambiguous, trying to actually articulate it is that there is no way to really articulate this leap forward from one to the other, because it doesn't happen in a specific moment. But at the same time, it's endlessly, this leap forward from the imaginary to the symbolic, in a sense, is endlessly repeated throughout, even within the symbolic. And I think that that has to do with this really beautiful passage here. It really is a testament to Lacan's artistry in making his points. And he himself says, I think I always talk about this, the formation of the pact of marriage. You are my wife, you are my husband. This is the ultimate expression of full speech. in a sense. This is as full as speech can get, where speech is literally mobilized to change uh, another person and another person's life, the limitations. And this is, I love the way he says this. But before I get to that, just the whole idea is that when you say to another person, you are my wife, you are my husband, this is a privileged use of language which is distinct from the way speech operates in most other contexts. And we admit that, we understand that. You don't have to study philosophy or psychoanalysis to acknowledge that. If you believe that, if you've ever accepted marriage as an institution, you understand what this means on an intuitive level. You bring someone else into almost like another kind of symbolic order. And what I love here is how he phrases it. Brilliant. And here, not to compare people, because comparison is the thief of joy, but he reaches another genital plane, let's say, that Sartre can't, which is, he almost fills in the gap, I think, within Sartre's understanding of the scopic drive.
Yes.
This statement, which I think this is just such a beautiful, brilliant statement. Actually, I'm going to highlight this too and read it all. He says, we want to become for the other an object that has the same limiting value for him as does, in relation to his freedom, his own body. We not only want to become for the other that in which his freedom is alienated, without a shadow of a doubt. Freedom has to enter into it, since commitment is an essential element of our requirement to be loved, but it must also be much more than a free commitment. And I'll keep reading. We require that a freedom accept its own renunciation, so as to be from that moment on limited to everything capricious, imperfect, in truth inferior, the paths along which it is swept by its captation by that object which we ourselves are. Mwah.
Bars. What does Merleau-Ponty have to say about this body? No, that's a later project. But it's like with Sartre, it's like the freedom of one's own body. I feel like it's the same as Lacan would say about the body, as far as being fragmented through this mirror stage. It's like, if we talk about the body and it's being itself in the world, right? But it's totally alienated so long as you're always for yourself, or you're in this threshold of for itself, which, all Sartrean mumbo jumbo aside, if we're thrown into the world that is symbolically structured, we don't know his, or I don't know her own, or I don't know my own body, so long as it's always situated in the form of fragmentation, alienation. So that I'm always becoming not for myself, but for others. There's always referentiality. It's always reference towards the other's enjoyment. The body is always situated to enjoy in fragments for the other, so long as I'm mapping.
And what I also get from this is, though, with the self-enclosed primary love of autoerotism, that sometimes Lacan does, is when you think he's trying to show you what is missing in another person's theory, he's actually inverting the theory itself to explain what's going on. And that, in a sense, what's happening here is he's showing how there's already within autoerotism something of a I wouldn't say a symbolic pact necessarily, but like a um, something, well, something of it. Well, we already established this, something of an intersubjective relationship, and that instead of saying this is what Balint's missing, he's trying to say that fundamental. This is what I was saying earlier. Fundamental to the pact that is something like, marriage,
Yes.
is already what occurs at the earliest stage of something like polymorphous perversity, in that what we are witnessing is, he says, his own body, a delimitation in terms of one's freedom. And there aren't stages where there is a qualitative difference from one to the other, but rather a question of its symbolization. But its symbolization doesn't, because the symbolic can't introduce anything new into the overall formulation of the world.
Yeah.
It's not an introduction of anything new. You don't get anything new from going from the imaginary to the symbolic, but what you get is expression. What you get is a way of being able to say what this thing is. I don't know if I'm being clear here. I feel like I'm really I have a point,
Well,
but I'm muddling it because it's like it's
maybe
really hard to say.
it's really I would just disagree in the sense it's like the way at least we understand the symbolic now would be way different than the way that is elaborated the symbolic in Seminar 2, in which there's always breakdowns, but in this breakdowns that something is always renewed in a sense. So, and that's obviously because he's building up towards death drive. So there's something new to that aspect of the symbolic that we haven't been I guess thrown into, or we haven't been exposed to by Lacan's lectures.
No,
In
I feel that I feel like I've failed in trying to express what I want to express here. I,
But
okay.
the thing is, like right now, he's like only giving so little to the symbolic. Like we get echoes and different like example, like different iterations of symbolic, but we don't really know what the symbolic is besides the function of speech, and we only get the term the symbol. We really hardly get the signifier, like in function and field,
Well,
which
okay.
we will get in the end of the seminar, but it's definitely not like Seminar 2, I should say.
All right.
It's
So
definitely not like Seminar 2.
let's bring it back to the signifier. Let's bring this back to Fort Da. That's where okay, this is what I'm thinking. It's like almost like as if this is the adult version of Fort Da. And this is, all right, I'm really going out on a limb here. It could be totally wrong. This could be complete nonsense word salad, but think of it as, with Fort Da, you gain a position of mastery through a sadomasochistic position of mastery through the signifier itself. Now here we have something similar, like we have the signifier, but this is the signifier that changes one's symbolic reality, where again there is a kind of sadomasochistic mechanism at work here, but it's one that's turned in on itself and truly in a socially ratified sense changes a person's reality. And I think when he says his own body, it's like freedom consists in the gap between Fort and Da. Freedom
Yeah.
consists in the gap between here and there, gone and back. And to limit one's freedom, or to embody one's freedom, is to limit it in a strange way. And here we have the signifier brought to a fruition in that there is some, in a strange way, some kind of progress made past Fort Da, which doesn't actually achieve anything. But this is almost like the culmination of Fort Da in that you actually are changing someone's life, and most likely causing someone to suffer deeply, no matter how happy your marriage is. You are limiting someone's freedom. So you are bringing the signifier to a point of true something verging on what in America we might call success, of like something actually happening. Success means happening in
Yeah.
its root, in its Latin root. So you're making something happen. What does it mean to make something happen? It's like in marriage, you make something happen with the power of a specific word. And the signifier, though, can't make anything good happen. It can't make anything truly happy happen. Commitment is commitment to some commitment to unhappiness to a degree. So you are ultimately using the signifier to change reality and bring signifier to it, the signifier to its lacking limit.
No, definitely. And then to bring Fort Da and it like so long yeah, as if there's an intersubjective relationship, then yeah, there is this undermining so far as like there is this other in an intersubjective relationship of repetition of expelling and bringing back in
Or,
whatever that could be, especially if it's a transference love or if it's a relationship in love.
or we could also say, the beautiful thing here, got like within this paragraph, you could talk about this for hours, and we do have to wrap up. But this idea that a freedom accept its own renunciation. What could be more free than freedom accepting its own renunciation and being limited to everything capricious and perfect? What could be more free than me as a subject giving up my freedom to be ultimately constrained by the contingencies of your will, of your
Yeah.
reality, of the like
And
that's the ultimate expression of freedom in a strange
like
sense.
capitalism in what Jesus talks about is just like interpassivity and just like giving like the ability to give up your duties to believe in it and just allowing it to believe for you, this ethical consumption, or like you could buy something on Etsy and the fact that like yeah, it's a handcraft jewelry and it's just like this product is made in Croatia, but it's from this, local artisan. So I'm just gonna, they're looking out of their own free will type shit. So it's not like corporationism or anything like that. It's still capitalism. It's still the monopoly of an app. But the
Yeah,
fact that it has a human face just believes for me, right?
which is, this is that the interpassivity, which is the submission to the signifier, ultimately is interpassive, because that's one thing that, as Zizek says in Plague of Fantasies, which is like the ultimate expression of interpassivity is the signifier, which acts for you. It says for you.
Yeah, because you don't want to buy off of Jeff Bezos because he bought a rocket, that means he's evil. Like, you know.
He, if you think Sartre's eyes are weird, that
Yeah.
guy's got one big puffy eye, and Jeff Bezos. All right. We were going ham there. I don't know if anyone says that anymore. I'm old. I'm an old man going cray. I'm funky fresh. Uh, I don't
I see.
know. Uh, I'm beginning to lose steam, but this is the point where we might leave out something important if we miss it. So what do we want to say here?
I
Uh,
think the main thing is just like, again, with gaze, he does take the part of the double gaze of the fact that not only do I see you, but you see me, but then I know that you see me. That's the third part. The fact of the perversion tying in, like, I think just to kind of sum it up, is the fact that there is this unconscious aspect, because again, a Sartre doesn't have unconsciousness, he just only has bad faith, of the enjoyment of being the object for the other, or somebody being an object for you, in that sense. That is the point in which Lacan likes Balint, but Balint doesn't really push the limits of object theory to intersubjectivity, or even to something that's more nuanced with Lacan is the symbolic order, or something like polymorphous perversity, which definitely defies this necessity of genital love or pregenital love. And the conditions of polymorphous perversity allow for something like a perversion, just in general. Not that it's necessarily going to create perversion, but that in order for perversion to exist, it seems like the state of polymorphous perversity must happen to allow any type of clinical structure to happen. Like, because psychoanalysis is not something that is about trying to find causal origins. It's like, caused his psychosis, like yada yada, like what is the chemical imbalance, or like, trying to create a reduction, answer. Rather, it is retroactive. It's the neutrality. It's
Yeah,
retroactivity with
yeah,
through
yeah.
session.
And I want to point out something that he says here, and I just like reading Lacan, but I'll read it. In adults who are aware of the palpable richness of perversion, perversion in sum is the privileged exploration of an existential possibility of human nature, its internal tearing apart, its gap, through which the supranatural world of the symbolic was able to make its entry. But if the child is a polymorphous pervert, does this mean that one has to project onto him the qualitative value of the perversion as it is experienced in the adult? In the child, are we obliged to search out an intersubjectivity of the same type as that which we see to be constitutive of perversion in the adult? Because we always see perversion from the standpoint of the adult because they're
Yeah.
perverts in the world, and even if you don't accept that as a structure, you might still interpret certain people's behavior as perverted. So you can't help but see it from the point of view of adult life. But I feel like what Lacan is saying is that if it is to be considered as the like primal generation of uh, human psychic reality itself, then this is the reversal I feel like I was talking about earlier before. It's like, and what Zizek does a lot too, is a Hegelian reversal. Instead of trying to fill in what's missing in another person's system, you have to turn it inside out.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that if I'm saying anything meaningful here, but you know, there's so much in this one paragraph, and also this idea that I love this the supernatural world of the symbolic was able to make its entry. So the point I see with subjectivity and the importance of subjectivity and what exists in repetition is not so much just like, oh, I'm caught in the death drive, but I think I'm doing this, but it's just death drive. It's like, no, death drive takes on a linguistic form, and in the repetition we are endlessly repeating this fictional mythical moment of entering into the symbolic. The pervert is more honest in their endless repetitive pursuit of enjoyment, then the neurotic, not that no one can enjoy fully and directly. That's impossible, but they enjoy the repetition. And the thing with the pervert is, what's disturbing about the pervert is not what they enjoy, but the fact that they continue to enjoy it. There are no
Yeah.
there are no diminishing returns for the
Yes, and
pervert.
and
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 that's
they
what's
think that
disturbing.
they are repetitively enjoined by choice.
Right. Yes, exactly. That's uh, and they're orchestrating it. And
Yeah.
what they're enjoying is that choice, right?
And that's the whole thing about them taking the master signifier in their own hands if they knew it, but like taking the symbolic and they're identifying with the law pretty much. The
And
whole kind of exile thing.
what about this, that, and when you think it's like they're enjoying it by choice, they want you to know that they're enjoying it. They want to broadcast their enjoyment to the world as a whole, which in that sense, when we're talking about Sartre and shame, when we say someone has no shame, it's as if they're not caught in the gaze of the other. They aren't
Yeah.
objectified in the gaze of the other. They're able to elude that in a strange way.
Yeah, and if there's a Zizek element to it, then fetishistic disavow means like a perverted aspect of like trying to create some utility to justify why you should enjoy it to the fullest. And if you're not enjoying it to the fullest, then you're wrong. And I'm gonna mutilate you in some way.
Right, because yeah, because and you're indicted in it. You're
Yes.
implicated in it. It's not just, oh, I like this a lot, and you're afraid to enjoy what you enjoy. Well, it's like, look at me enjoying.
Yeah.
You can't enjoy as directly as I can, and you're the object.
Yeah. It's like
Usually the enjoying object, like if you're ashamed of being caught enjoying, then you are the like you're made the object, but the pervert turns it on you and saying that you're the object because you can't enjoy directly.
yeah, it makes me think like the like disgruntled teenagers like his hystericizing their parents like why are we always celebrating Christmas or Easter? It's like what does the Santa Claus or Easter Bunny have to do with Jesus? You know, and then like you could be like oh, what is it, not Riley, is it's Huey from Boondocks, and he's like, Jesus was black, Ronald Reagan was the devil, like just like questioning like why these white folks are celebrating like Christmas and all this stuff. But like, you know, if you're that disgruntled like adolescent or teenager, then it's just like you're questioning your parents, just like, well, even if Jesus didn't wasn't born on Christmas and he was born in the spring, like it makes me happy to celebrate Christmas. Plus, this is the only time we get to see your family. And it's just like, well, we could see our family every other weekend because we always have time off and they have time off. You could justify all they want, but they're gonna always try to disavow the fact and say that, like, you know, it makes me happy to celebrate Christmas and, you know, I get to buy you presents and all these things. So you just be grateful. You're the one that's not enjoying and you're ruining my enjoyment. It's yeah, that's how I see it in the social sense. It's like even if you try to call them out on their bluff, it's like they have to justify why they fetishize
So
Christmas.
is the logic of enjoyment always running along the vein of all of our enjoyment, everything we do, in a sense?
As far as like holiday enjoyment, seems like it's always in some sort of capitalist discourse. Like the the reason why we celebrate it is a phantom, and we only celebrate it for the fact of enjoying.
What about this? Okay, so two more things I want to touch on before we finish up. When you are dead, mommy, I'll have your hats, or when granddad dies.
Yeah.
This elicits the adult's adulation of the child. And I like this because he says that they conceive of their child as either an animal or a god. Far too often we take them for animals. There's something divine and self-enclosed about this indifference about what would in a adult would be considered evil becomes cute in the child. Where is the perversion in that? You know, he says it has to do with the fact that they can make use of language.
I think
How the
yeah, they make use of
activity goes.
language. They maybe find enjoyment in creating circuits that like aren't part of communication, but like they can make use of language. But we conceive of them as divine beings. That's like almost like a fetishism right there. Like they're somehow pure and they somehow are outside of like, in a sense, the aspect of being an adult and how cruel the world is, like the fetishism of just like putting them on a pedestal, even though we know, like, we were kids once, we were in elementary school, how assholes like kids could be and they could bully other people, put in a
Well, it's
social
funny. Yeah, we attribute to them a capacity for escaping the cruelty of the world, and yet they may have a full understanding of, or are the complete encapsulation of that cruelty
yeah.
at the same time, which is
Yeah,
also
and if that's the case, when we look at an institution, we realize there's fights going on every week at school or like yada yada yada. We just got to implement some Bevan shit, like, just communication. It's just like we're not understanding each other. It's just the cultural differences. At communication apprehension, we have this inherent anxiety because we don't understand the other.
And then finally, this is the last thing I want to read before you wrap up. Been going on for a while, but
Yeah.
intersubjectivity is given in the manipulation of the symbol. This is the case right from the beginning. That's the interesting thing. The symbol exists right from the beginning. Everything begins with the possibility of naming, which is both destructive of the thing and allows the passage of the thing onto the symbolic plane, thanks to
Yes.
which the truly human register comes into its own. It is from that point on, in a more and more complicated manner, the embodiment of the symbolic within the imaginary experience takes place. The symbolic will shape all those inflections which, in the life of the adult, the imaginary commitment, the original captation can take on.
And this is like why I think what was so like specific about choosing Dick and Robert, the symbol, the fact that Robert couldn't communicate, but I guess language as or little Dick had language at his disposal. So like when Melanie Klein was toying with him, saying these words, he was able to fire off like that and make connections. Robert with the wolf, that was the symbol, right? He didn't have communication, but there was this use of a master signifier of the wolf. So in a sense, the symbolic was at his disposal, but just couldn't have speech. They both didn't have speech for an extent. And I think
That
that's
was also the superego, right?
yeah, like in the superego can only happen if you're already in the symbolic. How can you have a superego if you don't even have an ego? Or at least some aspect of it, like some mutilated form. Some like you're kind of mirror, but you're not, but it's like in the process of trying to mirror, it's always again like the way a little girl, it's like the side of aggressivity and trying to mirror, she hits the little boy in the head, upside the head, at the side of the lure. And in Robert, a lot of that was happening. But yet, because he was always around like a lot of adults, there was this like attempt to try to it have admission in the symbolic. especially since he had wolf. That ingrained image and symbolic signification of wolf was ingrained with him, but it's just like it wasn't. There was no like metaphor. It's just like going in opposite directions. It wasn't intersecting.
No metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm done. I don't know
Yeah.
if any more theory left in me right now.
I think that's good enough. Yeah.
It's
We don't need to read the whole chapter. It's a pretty short chapter.
a good one though.
Yeah.
So I will end on this message. If you're a pervert of any kind, don't cede ground relative to your desire, but also don't sue me
Yeah.
for telling you that. There, I would say that most people shouldn't, but there are a few categories of people that should cede ground relative to their desire, and a lot of it, because it's fucked up otherwise.
Yeah.
And that is that.